The legends surrounding King Arthur belong to a much later stage of Welsh tradition than the older mythological stories centered on figures such as Gwydion, Pwyll, or Pryderi. This difference is easy to recognize because those ancient tales form part of the collection known as the Four Branches of the Mabinogi, while no Arthurian story originally belonged to that group. Over time, however, many people began using the word Mabinogion as a general label for every old Welsh tale. That interpretation became especially common after Lady Charlotte Guest published her famous collection, yet it does not accurately reflect the original meaning of the term. Among the 11 stories included in Guest's edition, only 4 truly belong to the Mabinogi tradition. These are Pwyll, Prince of Dyfed, Branwen, daughter of Lear, Manawydan, son of Lear, and Math, son of Mathonwy. Together they form what scholars usually call the Four Branches of the Mabinogi, a distinct group of narratives with their own purpose and identity. The remaining stories may share the same cultural background, but they were never originally classified in the same way. The word Mabinogi itself comes from Mabinogi, a title used within the Welsh bardic tradition. A Mabinogi was not a child listening to bedtime stories, but a young apprentice training under an experienced bard. At the earliest stage of his education, he had not yet mastered the art of composing poetry. Instead, he learned through stories, traditions, and historical narratives that served as the foundation of his literary education. The Mabinogi was therefore not simply a collection of entertaining tales. It represented the material every apprentice bard was expected to know before advancing to higher levels of learning. These narratives were likely performed publicly according to established customs, and a trained apprentice may even have been permitted to recite them professionally for an agreed payment. As his education progressed, he was expected to acquire poetic skills and eventually rise through the ranks of Welsh literary culture. This background makes it clear that the Mabinogi was never intended as children's literature. Although later generations sometimes misunderstood its purpose, the stories themselves contain complex themes, political conflicts, supernatural events, and symbolic imagery that were designed for a mature audience. Like many early Celtic traditions, the Four Branches rely heavily on magic, divine intervention, enchanted objects, transformations, and encounters with beings from the other world. These supernatural elements were not unusual, but formed the very heart of early Welsh storytelling. The oldest Arthurian traditions were probably no different. Before they became famous across Europe, the stories of Arthur almost certainly belonged to the same Brythonic storytelling tradition and contained many mythical features that later disappeared from popular versions. Everything changed after the Norman conquest of South Wales. Norman nobles and writers became fascinated by the native legends they encountered and began reshaping them for a new audience. Rather than preserving the stories exactly as they had been told by Welsh storytellers, they adapted them to fit the ideals of continental chivalry. Knights, courtly adventures, romantic quests, and refined aristocratic values gradually replaced many of the older supernatural themes. As these rewritten versions spread throughout Europe, they developed into the Arthurian romances that became widely known during the Middle Ages. Interestingly, the cultural exchange did not move in only one direction. Some of these French and Anglo-Norman adaptations eventually returned to Wales, where they influenced later Welsh manuscripts. In several cases, they even altered or replaced parts of the original native traditions. One revealing example appears in the Welsh tale of Peredur, where the fortress called Ysbydinongyl seems to preserve a Welsh form of a name that had already passed through French literary tradition. The French romances referred to a knight called Espinogre or Epinogris, yet linguistic evidence suggests that both ultimately derive from the Welsh giant Ysbyddaden. This shows that the story originally came from Brythonic tradition, but later re-entered Welsh literature through French adaptation rather than direct native transmission. The surviving Welsh Arthurian narratives can generally be divided into two separate groups. The first includes Culhwch and Olwen, together with The Dream of Rhonabwy. These stories remained largely untouched by Norman literary influence and therefore preserve much more of the ancient Welsh imagination. Magic, giants, impossible tasks, enchanted landscapes, and supernatural encounters dominate their narratives, while the ideals of medieval knighthood play only a minor role. The second group consists of Owain and Luned, Peredur son of Efrog, and Geraint and Enid. These tales clearly reflect the influence of French Arthurian romance. Many of their episodes closely resemble stories found in continental literature, particularly those connected with the legends of the Holy Grail and the adventures of the Round Table. Although their foundations remain Brythonic, the versions preserved today bear unmistakable signs of adaptation and literary exchange. Some sections may even represent direct translations or creative reworkings of French sources rather than entirely independent Welsh compositions. This blending of traditions demonstrates how deeply interconnected medieval literature had become. The Welsh stories preserved ancient Celtic material, while French and Anglo-Norman authors transformed that material into new forms that later influenced Welsh writers in return. As a result, anyone seeking to understand the complete Arthurian tradition cannot rely solely on the surviving Welsh texts. Certain legendary themes, characters, and mythological elements have disappeared from Welsh manuscripts altogether and survive only in continental romances that ultimately trace their origins back to Brythonic storytelling. One final detail further supports the great age of the four branches of the Mabinogi. Throughout these four narratives, there is not a single reference to Arthur or his famous companions. Considering Arthur's enormous popularity in later medieval literature, this silence is highly significant. It suggests that the four branches belong to an earlier literary world that existed before Arthur rose to become the central heroic figure of Welsh and European tradition. By contrast, the later Welsh Arthurian tales reveal a far looser structure and clearly reflect centuries of adaptation, borrowing, and reinterpretation, illustrating how legends continually evolved as they crossed linguistic, cultural, and political boundaries. Unlike the ancient Welsh myths, the later Arthurian stories developed within a very different literary environment. Welsh scholars and poets formed a highly traditional community that tended to preserve older native traditions rather than reshape every new tale that entered their culture. Because of this, many Arthurian narratives, filled with the ideals of chivalry, noble courts, and Christian values introduced by the Normans, were never fully absorbed into the older Welsh storytelling tradition. Instead, they often remained a separate branch of literature, influenced as much by continental romance as by native Celtic legend. The difference between these traditions becomes clear when comparing the Arthurian tales with the four branches of the Mabinogi. In the story of Branwen, for example, Bran the Blessed orders that after his death his severed head should be buried beneath the White Hill in London, facing toward France. According to the tale, as long as the head remained undisturbed, Britain would be protected from foreign invasion. Yet later, Welsh tradition tells a very different story. One of the Welsh triads claims that Arthur himself uncovered Bran's buried head because he believed Britain should rely on the courage of its people rather than on magical protection. Far from being celebrated, this act was remembered as one of the three unfortunate uncoverings, suggesting that Arthur belonged to a later layer of tradition built upon stories that already existed. If these tales were intended as strict historical accounts, their chronology would make little sense. Characters from much older legends regularly appear alongside Arthur as though they all lived during the same era. Nowhere is this more obvious than in Cŵl Hwch and Olwen, where Arthur's court seems almost limitless. Instead of gathering only believable companions, the storyteller includes an extraordinary collection of heroes, mythical beings, magical figures, and strange individuals drawn from every corner of Welsh tradition. Some survive only as names, preserving the memory of stories that have otherwise vanished forever. This literary approach was not unique to Wales. Irish tradition gathered countless heroes around King Conchobar, while Norse mythology imagined Odin ruling over Valhalla, surrounded by gods and legendary warriors from many different traditions. The Arthurian legends seem to have followed a similar pattern. As Arthur's reputation grew, storytellers continually expanded his household by adding famous characters from older myths, creating the impression that every remarkable hero had somehow served the great king. The result, however, produced a court filled with rather unusual personalities. Some companions possessed extraordinary abilities that hardly suited the elegant atmosphere of a royal palace. One man was remembered solely because he could stand on a single foot for an entire day without moving. Another was famous for never smiling unless he had completely satisfied his enormous appetite. After earning the right to request any reward from his king, he simply demanded an immense feast. According to tradition, providing that single meal became one of Cornwall's greatest disasters because of the impossible quantity of food required. Such stories preserved fascinating pieces of Celtic mythology, but they also reveal that Arthur's court was never intended to resemble a realistic medieval kingdom. It is easy to imagine that many of these remarkable companions spent more time away on impossible adventures than actually sitting around the famous Round Table. Their absence probably made Arthur's court far more manageable than the legends suggest. As the tradition expanded, writers became increasingly interested in presenting Arthur not merely as a warrior, but as the ruler of the greatest court in Britain. This desire to surround him with countless celebrated heroes developed alongside another trend: the transformation of relatively simple Celtic legends into long, elaborate romances filled with quests, tournaments, and courtly ideals. Evidence for Arthur's growing popularity even appears within the Welsh triads themselves. Although these collections were carefully organized around groups of 3, later versions occasionally forced Arthur into lists that originally contained only 3 names, creating awkward groups of 4. This small detail reveals how enormously his reputation had grown. Later generations simply could not resist including Arthur wherever they believed Britain's greatest heroes should be remembered. Despite these later additions, the triad still preserves some of the oldest surviving traditions connected with Arthur. Interestingly, they often portray him in ways that later romance writers chose to ignore. Medieval authors preferred the polished king of Camelot, surrounded by noble knights and refined ceremonies, while older Welsh tradition preserved fragments of a far stranger and more mysterious figure whose roots reached much deeper into Celtic mythology. Recognizing that the fully developed Arthurian legend belongs to a relatively late period does not mean that its foundations were new. On the contrary, the stories themselves drew upon traditions that had existed for centuries among Brythonic-speaking peoples in both Britain and Brittany. The later romances merely reshaped ancient material into forms that appealed to medieval audiences without erasing the much older beliefs hidden beneath them. This naturally raises one of the most enduring questions in British history. Was Arthur an actual historical figure? Welsh literature offers an intriguing clue. Unlike many native rulers, Arthur is rarely described simply as a prince. Instead, he is almost always given the title of emperor. That distinction may preserve the memory of a real political office rather than merely expressing admiration. After the Roman withdrawal from Britain, the island's military command was divided among several senior officers. One defended the northern frontier along Hadrian's Wall, another protected the southeastern coastline, while the Comes Britannia held broader authority to move wherever military action was needed. Some historians have suggested that if a historical Arthur existed, he may have occupied a position similar to this final office. Such an interpretation would explain why Welsh tradition consistently places him above regional rulers and grants him the title of emperor rather than prince. The Welsh language even borrowed the Latin word imperator, eventually transforming it into its own native form. It is therefore possible that, after direct Roman rule ended, this prestigious title continued to be used for Britain's highest military commander. If Arthur really held such a position, the famous phrase Emperor Arthur may preserve a genuine memory of Britain's post-Roman political structure rather than being a purely legendary invention. This idea also fits surprisingly well with one of the earliest historical sources connected with Arthur. The Historia Brittonum describes him not as a king ruling over Britain, but as the military leader chosen to command the armies of several British rulers during their wars against invading enemies. Such a role resembles that of a supreme commander rather than an independent monarch. Other medieval writers introduce further possibilities. Some scholars have proposed that Arthur may even have been connected to the royal family, later represented by Maelgwn Gwynedd. Yet the surviving evidence is frustratingly vague. The 6th century writer Gildas refers to one of Maelgwn's predecessors without even mentioning his name, suggesting that, whatever his identity, he was not regarded as uniquely famous during his own lifetime. This uncertainty leads to perhaps the most fascinating explanation of all. The legendary Arthur who dominates medieval romance may not have emerged solely from the achievements of a historical warrior. Long before the stories of Camelot were written, Brythonic tradition may already have known a supernatural figure or even a deity bearing the name Arthur. If a real military leader later carried the same name, or if two similar names gradually merged through changes in language, the legendary and historical traditions could easily have become inseparable. Over generations, the exploits of a remarkable commander and the attributes of an ancient divine figure may have fused together, producing the Arthur whose legend eventually spread across all of medieval Europe. For a moment, let us set aside the question of whether Arthur was a real historical figure and instead consider him purely as a legendary being. If Arthur originally belonged to mythology, he would most naturally fit the role of a culture hero, a figure remembered not only for his extraordinary deeds, but also for bringing order, customs, and civilization to his people. In Welsh tradition, he is portrayed as the ideal ruler, the founder of the famous Round Table, and the leader of remarkable expeditions into the mysterious realm of the otherworld. His relationship with the hero Gwalchmai also mirrors older Celtic mythological pairings, much like the connection between Gwydion and Liu in the ancient Welsh legends. Arthur's royal court occupies a central place in later tradition. Surrounded by his loyal companions, he resembles Conchobar among the heroes of Ulster or Odin presiding over the gods in Valhalla. Yet, one detail has attracted particular attention throughout history: the Round Table itself. Although its circular shape has often been treated as symbolic, the more important feature may actually be the table rather than its form. Early Celtic courts were not typically imagined as places where everyone gathered around a single dining table. Irish and Norse legends rarely describe such an arrangement. If Arthur's court was remembered as the first where nobles sat together at one common table, the Round Table may have symbolized a new social custom, rather than simply equality among knights. This interpretation fits remarkably well with Arthur's image as a bringer of civilization. Medieval tradition even traces the origin of the Round Table back to Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon. Behind that familiar royal figure, however, some scholars detect echoes of an older mythical ruler connected with the otherworld, the supernatural realm from which many Celtic traditions believed knowledge and culture first emerged. In that sense, the Round Table could represent far more than a piece of furniture. It may have symbolized prosperity, unity, and abundance, much like the legendary tables of the gods in Greek mythology where divine feasts were said to take place. Arthur's journeys into the otherworld form another important part of his mythical identity. One of the oldest Welsh poems, attributed to Taliesin, describes an expedition in which Arthur and his companions travel to the realm of the dead in search of a magical cauldron belonging to the ruler of that mysterious kingdom. The cauldron was no ordinary treasure. It represented supernatural power, wisdom, and perhaps even rebirth. This ancient myth appears to survive in altered form within the tale of Culhwch and Olwen. In that story, Arthur no longer sails to the otherworld itself. Instead, he travels to Ireland to seize the magical cauldron owned by a powerful warrior named Divernach. Arthur and his men defeat its defenders, kill Divernach, capture the prized vessel, and return to Dyfed carrying not only the cauldron, but also the wealth of Ireland. Although the setting has become more realistic, the structure of the narrative strongly suggests that it originated as an older myth about a heroic descent into a supernatural realm before later storytellers relocated the adventure to a recognizable earthly kingdom. Geoffrey of Monmouth expanded this tradition even further. What had once been a mythical raid for a magical object became, in his hands, the story of a full-scale conquest of Ireland. Arthur was transformed from a legendary hero into an emperor whose victories steadily enlarged his dominion. Geoffrey followed the same pattern elsewhere. Arthur's campaign into northern Britain, where he appoints Arawn as ruler of Scotland, may preserve another memory of an older myth. In Welsh tradition, Arawn is not simply a human king, but the ruler of Andublin, the Welsh otherworld itself. Replacing Anodwin with Scotland therefore appears to be another example of mythology gradually becoming historical narrative. To medieval audiences, this transformation probably seemed perfectly natural. The lands beyond Roman Britain had long been imagined as mysterious and dangerous places. Ancient writers described the territory beyond Hadrian's Wall as hostile, unhealthy, and inhabited by terrifying creatures. Such descriptions blurred the boundary between unknown geography and supernatural imagination, making it easy for mythical kingdoms to become real countries in later retellings. Something similar may explain Arthur's legendary conquest of Scandinavia. Early Welsh tradition used the name Leichlin to describe a mysterious land associated with the sea or hidden beneath its waters. As Viking raids became increasingly common, the same word gradually came to mean Norway and the Scandinavian world. Thus, what may originally have been a mythical expedition into an enchanted realm evolved into a military campaign against a real northern kingdom. Geoffrey continued the pattern by placing Loth on the Scandinavian throne, linking Arthur's growing empire with regions already familiar to medieval readers. Once Arthur had supposedly conquered Scotland, Ireland, and Scandinavia, the next step required very little imagination. Later, chroniclers naturally extended his victories across continental Europe, carrying his armies toward the Alps and even Rome itself. In this way, a legendary hero whose earliest adventures centered on supernatural journeys gradually became the ruler of a vast earthly empire stretching across much of the known world. Another fascinating tradition presents Arthur in a very different role. Earlier, Welsh mythology tells how Gwydion cleverly tricked Pryderi into surrendering magical pigs that belonged to the ruler of the otherworld. A similar theme later appears in the Arthurian tradition, although with an important difference. According to one of the Welsh triads, Arthur and his companions attempted to obtain the pigs belonging to March, son of Merchion. In both Welsh and Irish tradition, March is closely associated with dark supernatural powers and later became identified with the king, Mark of the Tristan legends. March was married to the beautiful Esilt, while his greatest champion was his nephew Dristan, better known in later romance as Tristan. One day, Dristan sent the royal swineherd away with a message for Esilt and took charge of the pigs himself. During this brief opportunity, Arthur arrived hoping to acquire some of the famous herd. Judging from the older myth involving Gwydion, one might expect Arthur to succeed through cleverness or deception. Surprisingly, however, the surviving version of the triad declares that Arthur failed completely. Despite every possible attempt, honest or dishonest, he could not obtain even a single pig from Dristan's protection. The story becomes even more intriguing when its development is examined. The earliest form of the triad simply listed 3 legendary swineherds celebrated for guarding their animals. Later writers expanded this brief tradition by explaining that no one had ever managed to steal so much as 1 pig from their care. In doing so, however, they overlooked the much older tale in which Gwydion had already deceived Pryderi and carried away his magical pigs. This inconsistency suggests that Arthur may once have possessed a similar story in which he also succeeded through trickery, but that version has since disappeared. Even though the complete narrative has been lost, the surviving fragments still preserve an important clue. They reveal that Arthur was once imagined not merely as a noble king, but as a resourceful figure willing to rely on deception when necessary. In this respect, he resembles the older Celtic heroes, whose intelligence and cunning were often valued just as highly as their courage in battle. Long before Arthur became the perfect Christian monarch of medieval romance, he may have belonged to a much older world of myth, where cleverness, magic, and supernatural adventure were inseparable from true heroism. Another important figure in the Arthurian tradition is Gwalchmai, one of the greatest heroes of Welsh legend and the warrior who later became known across Europe as Sir Gawain. In the oldest Welsh traditions, however, Gwalchmai is far more than simply one of Arthur's knights. He belongs to the same legendary class of heroic figures as Lo in Welsh mythology and Cuchulainn in Irish tradition, heroes whose lives combine extraordinary courage with unmistakable supernatural qualities. Welsh tradition also gives Gwalchmai a brother named Gwalchafed, whose name eventually evolved into the famous Galahad of the Grail romances. As Arthurian legends spread across Europe, these ancient Brythonic names were reshaped by different languages. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote the name as Walganus. French romances transformed it into Gauvin. English literature adopted Gawain, while Scotland preserved the familiar form Gavin. Although the names changed from country to country, they all point back to the same legendary Welsh hero. The Welsh name Gwalchmai itself carries a fascinating meaning. It appears to combine the words for hawk or falcon with the month of May, producing a title that can be understood as the Falcon of May. The exact reason for this unusual name has never been fully explained, yet many scholars believe it reflects Gwalchmai's connection with the returning strength of the sun during late spring and early summer. If he originally represented a solar hero, the symbolism becomes remarkably appropriate. Like the growing sunlight of May, his power reached its greatest brilliance as the day advanced. Among all the warriors who served Arthur, Gwalchmai enjoyed a unique position. He was consistently portrayed as the king's most trusted companion and perhaps his greatest champion. His reputation rested not only on courage, but also on a remarkable supernatural gift. During battle, his strength steadily increased from sunrise until noon, reaching its absolute peak at midday before gradually fading as the afternoon progressed. This extraordinary ability clearly distinguishes him from an ordinary human warrior and links him to the daily journey of the sun across the sky. Even his horse reflected this solar symbolism. Welsh romances describe its speed and brilliance by comparing it to sunlight itself. Throughout countless adventures, Gwalchmai remained virtually undefeated, suffering no complete defeat in battle until the very day of his death. Medieval storytellers therefore treated him not simply as a skilled knight, but as the living embodiment of heroic perfection, a figure whose fortunes rose and fell according to cosmic rhythms rather than ordinary human limitations. Geoffrey of Monmouth gives Gwalchmai a particularly prominent role during Arthur's continental campaigns. While Arthur is away fighting abroad, disaster strikes at home. Medrod, better known in later literature as Mordred, seizes both the throne and Queen Guinevere. Upon hearing the news, Arthur immediately abandons his foreign campaign and races back to Britain with Gwalchmai at his side. Their return leads to a fierce struggle along the coast, where Medrod's forces attempt to prevent Arthur's army from landing. Gwalchmai throws himself into the fighting with characteristic bravery, leading the assault against his brother's army. During the desperate battle, however, he is killed by Medrod himself. His death marks one of the turning points of the Arthurian story and carries far deeper mythological significance than a simple battlefield tragedy. Across many ancient mythologies, the great solar hero is destined to fall through conflict with a close relative or rival who represents darkness. Similar patterns appear in Irish tradition through Diarmait and in Norse mythology through Balder. The struggle between Gwalchmai and Medrod belongs to the same symbolic tradition. Gwalchmai embodies light, vitality, and the life-giving force of the sun, while Medrod represents darkness, destruction, and the powers that ultimately overcome the light. Geoffrey transforms this timeless myth into a political conflict by surrounding Medrod with Saxons, Picts, and Scots, turning an ancient cosmic struggle into a story of betrayal against Britain. After Gwalchmai's death, Arthur finally succeeds in bringing his army ashore. He pushes Medrod steadily westward across Britain until both armies meet in one final confrontation. This climactic battle becomes known in Welsh tradition as Camlan, and later enters popular legend as Camelot's last battle. Victory ultimately belongs to Arthur, but the triumph comes at an unbearable cost. Medrod falls on the battlefield, while Arthur himself receives wounds so severe that they prove fatal. Geoffrey presents this campaign almost as conventional military history. Arthur lands in southeastern England before pursuing Medrod through southern Britain until the decisive encounter. Yet the Welsh triads preserve a noticeably different version of events. Rather than focusing on Arthur's absence overseas or portraying Medrod simply as a traitor, they suggest that the hostility between the two had much deeper origins. According to these traditions, the conflict began with personal insults rather than political rebellion. Arthur himself struck Medrod, while another mysterious woman named Gwenhwyfach quarreled with Queen Gwenhwyfar, better known as Guinevere. These seemingly minor acts of violence gradually escalated into one of the greatest wars in Welsh legend. The triads also preserve stories of mutual raids carried out by the two rivals. During one attack, Medrod entered Arthur's court in Cornwall and consumed every available supply of food and drink, leaving nothing behind. Before departing, he dragged Guinevere from her throne and publicly humiliated her. Arthur later answered with equal brutality. He invaded Medrod's residence, destroyed its provisions, and slaughtered every living creature he found there, sparing neither people nor animals. These episodes present the feud not as a simple rebellion, but as a cycle of revenge in which both sides answered one outrage with another. Another fascinating tradition introduces a lesser-known figure named Idauk Cord Prydain, whose actions helped ensure the disaster at Camelot. According to the story, Idauk secretly revealed Arthur's plans to Medrod and deliberately distorted Arthur's attempts to negotiate peace before the final battle. Although Arthur still addressed Medrod as his nephew and hoped for reconciliation, Idauk's deception guaranteed that war would continue. In the remarkable tale known as the Dream of Rhonabwy, Idauk later admits his crimes without hesitation. He confesses that he betrayed Arthur simply because he loved warfare itself. After surviving the carnage of Camelot, he abandoned the battlefield before the fighting had fully ended, spent 7 years performing penance for his actions, and eventually sought forgiveness for the destruction he had helped create. The battle itself receives an unexpectedly unusual interpretation in the Welsh triads. Instead of celebrating Camelot purely as a heroic conflict, they classify it among Britain's 3 futile battles. Another triad explains this curious judgment by claiming that during the fighting, Arthur repeatedly divided his own warriors with Medrod, almost as though the struggle resembled a tournament rather than a genuine war. Such behavior was condemned as one of Britain's 3 criminal decisions, emphasizing that the conflict had descended into senseless destruction rather than honorable warfare. When the slaughter finally came to an end, only 3 warriors were said to have survived. Each escaped for a very different reason. Morvran possessed such terrifying features that his enemies believed he was a demon from hell and fled before him. Sander was so extraordinarily handsome that opposing soldiers mistook him for an angel sent from heaven and refused to strike him. The third survivor was Glúlwyd Gafael Fawr, whose immense size and overwhelming strength made him virtually impossible to overcome in combat. Together, these 3 remarkable figures reinforce the legendary nature of Camelot, where even survival depended less upon ordinary military skill than upon supernatural qualities that blurred the line between myth and history. These details are important because they help strip away the historical appearance that Geoffrey of Monmouth gave to the Battle of Camelot. Geoffrey presents the conflict almost like a genuine political and military event, complete with armies, succession, and recognizable rulers. After Arthur disappears from the story, authority passes through a series of kings: Constantine, Aurelius Cananus, Vortiporius, and Mulgo. These figures are immediately recognizable as the British rulers condemned by the 6th century writer Gildas, who rebuked them in almost exactly the same order. Geoffrey seems to have taken these historical names and arranged them as Arthur's successors, creating the impression that the legendary king belonged naturally within the political history of post-Roman Britain. Yet beneath this historical surface, the older myth remains visible. The death of Gwalchmai at the hands of Medrod follows a familiar mythological pattern. Gwalchmai, the solar warrior whose power increases with the rising sun, is overcome by a figure associated with darkness and destruction. Such an ending makes sense within the structure of the myth. The hero of light falls before the forces that oppose him, just as daylight must eventually surrender to night. Arthur's fate, however, is more difficult to explain. As the culture hero, protector, and central ruler, he survives long enough to defeat Medrod, only to leave the battlefield mortally wounded. This is not the conclusion one would normally expect from such a myth. In similar traditions, the fallen solar figure is often restored by a more powerful divine protector. Liu, for example, is brought back through the magic and wisdom of Gwydion. If the Arthurian story had followed the same pattern without interruption, Gwalchmai might also have returned in some transformed or renewed form. The strange ending may therefore preserve the influence of a real historical event. It is possible that the mythological Arthur became connected with the memory of an actual warrior who died in conflict with a relative or rival. The legendary battle between Arthur and his nephew may have absorbed the circumstances surrounding the death of a historical leader. Once this event entered the tradition, it altered the natural shape of the myth and forced storytellers to explain why the great protector himself vanished after victory. Popular imagination, however, refused to accept Arthur's permanent death. In the legends repeated by ordinary people, Arthur did not perish at Camelot. He was carried across the sea to the mysterious island of Avalon, where his wounds would be healed. Once restored, he would return to Britain in its darkest hour and rule again. This belief became one of the most enduring features of the Arthurian tradition. Different regions developed their own versions of the sleeping king. In some stories, Arthur and his warriors rest inside a hidden cavern beneath Snowdon, surrounded by weapons and treasure. They remain there until the appointed hour, when a supernatural bell will awaken them and summon them to defend Britain once more. Elsewhere, shepherds accidentally discover Arthur and his companions beneath Cadbury Hill, silently passing the centuries by playing chess in an underground chamber. A similar tradition became attached to the Eildon Hills in Scotland. There, Arthur and his warriors were believed to lie beneath the earth in an enchanted sleep, waiting for the sound of a horn to break the spell. When the signal finally comes, the ancient knights will rise, seize their swords, and march again from the supernatural world into the realm of men. Even Geoffrey of Monmouth, despite describing Arthur as mortally wounded, could not completely abandon this popular belief. Instead of recording the king's death directly, he says that Arthur was taken to Avalon to receive treatment for his wounds. The wording leaves open the possibility that the king survived and might someday return. Geoffrey's supposedly historical account therefore preserves the same uncertainty found in oral legend. The idea also appears in one of the earliest Welsh manuscripts, the Black Book of Carmarthen. In a poem listing the graves of famous heroes, the poet names the resting places of several legendary and historical figures. Yet, when he reaches Arthur, he refuses to identify a tomb. He declares that it is foolish to speak of Arthur's grave. The meaning is unmistakable. Unlike ordinary warriors, Arthur cannot be confined to a known burial place because his story has not truly ended. This tradition allows the historical Arthur to fade away while the greater legendary Arthur remains. Whether a real warrior, once inspired part of the story, becomes less important than the myth that grew around him. The king who returns, the ruler hidden beyond the mortal world, and the guardian waiting for Britain's moment of need became far more powerful than any uncertain historical memory. There is still, however, a difficult question concerning Arthur's relationship with Gwalchmai. Earlier mythological comparisons suggest that Arthur stood in relation to Gwalchmai much as Gwydion stood to Loiu, the older culture hero supporting, protecting, and guiding the younger solar champion. Yet the surviving romances describe Gwalchmai and Medrod merely as Arthur's nephews, the sons of his sister and King Loth. This family arrangement seems too distant to reflect the closeness implied by the older myth. The explanation may lie in the gradual reshaping of Arthur's character. The Arthurian legends survived for centuries in the hands of storytellers, poets, monks, and romance writers. Each generation altered the king to fit its own moral expectations. Uncomfortable episodes were softened, reinterpreted, or removed entirely. Over time, Arthur was transformed from an unpredictable Celtic hero into an almost flawless Christian monarch. This process reached its most polished form in later literature, where Arthur became the ideal ruler and Guinevere was increasingly blamed for the fall of his kingdom. Modern poets often presented him as morally pure, disciplined, and almost saintly. His weaknesses disappeared, while Guinevere's betrayal and desire were emphasized more severely. The complex and sometimes morally ambiguous king of early legend was replaced by a figure of perfect restraint and spiritual authority. A very different Arthur survives in Thomas Malory's account. There, the older and more troubling elements of the tradition remain visible. Malory tells how the wife of King Loth arrived at Arthur's court with her sons, including Gawain, Gaheris, Agravain, and Gareth. She was beautiful, richly dressed, and secretly sent to observe Arthur's court. Arthur became attracted to her, and the two slept together. From their union came Mordred, the child who would eventually destroy both Arthur and the Fellowship of the Round Table. The story becomes darker when it is revealed that the woman was Arthur's own sister. Mallory attempts to reduce Arthur's guilt by explaining that he did not know their true relationship. Arthur himself had grown up without full knowledge of his parents or family, and the woman was related to him through their mother. Only later did Merlin reveal what had happened. Disguised first as a child and then appearing in his true identity, Merlin warned Arthur that he had committed a terrible act and fathered the person destined to bring ruin upon his kingdom. Arthur was shocked not only by the prophecy, but also by the discovery of his own ancestry. Merlin explained that the king's future suffering would serve as punishment for his actions, even though the crime had been committed unknowingly. This version clearly shows how later, writers tried to preserve an ancient and disturbing tradition while protecting Arthur's reputation. The relationship could not be removed entirely because it was deeply embedded in the legend, but Arthur's responsibility was reduced. He did not knowingly choose his sister, and therefore the act became a tragic mistake rather than a deliberate crime. There are reasons to believe that an even older form of the myth was more direct. Gwalchmai and Medrod may originally have been not Arthur's nephews, but his own sons by the wife of King Loth. In that earlier version, both the brilliant solar hero and the destructive rival would have come from the same forbidden union. This would explain why Arthur's connection with Gwalchmai was originally much closer than later genealogies suggest. As Arthur's image became more noble, the tradition was gradually cleaned of this scandal. The first stage may have been the removal of Gwalchmai from the shameful origin. Since he was one of Arthur's most admired and honorable warriors, storytellers would have wished to protect his reputation. Medrod, as the traitor and destroyer of the kingdom, could remain the child of the forbidden relationship for much longer. The next step was to excuse Arthur by making him unaware that the woman was his sister. The final stage was to separate both men from him completely and describe them only as his nephews. By the time most Welsh and continental romances were written, this safer genealogy had become dominant. Welsh literature went even further and almost completely erased the scandal. The triads, despite preserving many strange and violent Arthurian traditions, say nothing about it. Yet it is unlikely that a medieval romance writer invented such an uncomfortable episode without an older tradition behind it. The story damages Arthur's character far too severely to have been created simply for entertainment. Its survival, even in softened form, suggests that it belonged to a much earlier mythological structure. Similar patterns appear in other mythologies, where divine or heroic families do not follow ordinary human rules. The culture hero may take the position of an older god and inherit relationships that originally belonged to that deity. In Greek tradition, Zeus marries his sister Hera, without the myth treating the union according to human morality. In the same way, Arthur may have absorbed the family role of an older Brythonic figure whose relationships were later considered unacceptable by Christian storytellers. The disturbing story therefore provides an important clue to Arthur's earliest identity. It strengthens the comparison between Arthur and older culture heroes, such as Gwydion or Caelbre. Behind the noble king of the Round Table may stand a far older supernatural ruler whose myths included forbidden unions, divine sons, conflicts between light and darkness, and the destruction and renewal of the world he governed. Geoffrey of Monmouth identifies King Loth's wife as Anna, yet there are good reasons to believe that she and Arthur's famous sister, Morgan le Fay, originally represented the same legendary figure. In the later romances, Morgan becomes one of the most mysterious women in Arthurian tradition, but her name itself offers an important clue. It most likely derives from the Welsh word Morgan, meaning sea-born, a name closely related to the Irish Myrgen, another title associated with the legendary water maiden Liban. These linguistic connections suggest that Morgan's roots reach far deeper than the medieval romances, extending back into much older Celtic mythology. If Anna and Morgan were originally one and the same, several otherwise puzzling episodes begin to make far more sense. Throughout the Arthurian romances, the relationship between Arthur and Morgan is marked by tension, rivalry, and open hostility. Yet the stories rarely explain the true origin of this conflict. Their constant opposition appears almost arbitrary, as though later storytellers preserved the rivalry while forgetting why it existed in the first place. A similar pattern can be found in older Welsh mythology. There, Gwydion and his sister Arianrhod are locked in a bitter struggle that shapes the destiny of their family. Their relationship is built upon deception, resentment, and supernatural conflict rather than ordinary family disagreements. Arthur's uneasy relationship with Morgan may therefore preserve a faded reflection of this much older mythological pattern, with the names changed but the essential structure remaining surprisingly similar. The parallel becomes even more striking when attention shifts to the next generation. Gwydion's son Lo and Arianrhod's son Dylan stand in sharp contrast to one another, representing opposing aspects of the myth. Something remarkably similar appears in the Arthurian tradition through Gwalchmai and Medrawd. One embodies loyalty, honor, and heroic brilliance, while the other becomes associated with betrayal, destruction, and the collapse of Arthur's kingdom. The same symbolic opposition seems to survive despite the stories having evolved into very different forms. As the Arthurian legends spread throughout Europe, however, this distinction gradually became blurred. Many romance writers no longer understood the original symbolic roles played by the two brothers. Instead of preserving Gwalchmai as the noble counterpart to Medrawd, they increasingly portrayed him as possessing many of the same darker qualities. This change is especially noticeable in the Tristan romances, where Gwalchmai often appears jealous, calculating, and deceitful rather than generous and heroic. Thomas Malory inherited much of this later tradition. In his version, Gawain frequently acts with anger, pride, and poor judgment. On several occasions, his decisions contribute directly to Arthur's greatest disasters. Instead of serving as the shining champion of the kingdom, he becomes one of the figures whose personal flaws accelerate the destruction of the Round Table. Such portrayals stand in sharp contrast to the older Welsh image of Gwalchmai as the nearly invincible solar hero, whose strength and honor distinguished him from every other knight. Interestingly, the opposite tendency may also have occurred in some Welsh traditions. One of the triads lists Medrawd among the 3 royal knights of Arthur's court, praising him for his gentleness, courtesy, and gracious speech. According to this tradition, he possessed such kindness and dignity that no one found it easy to refuse any request he made. This description differs dramatically from the familiar image of Mordred as the great traitor responsible for Camelot's destruction. These conflicting portrayals suggest that later writers often misunderstood or reshaped the original myth. Some darkened Gwalchmai's character until he resembled Medrawd, while others softened Medrawd until he appeared almost noble. In both cases, the clear, symbolic contrast that once separated the two heroes gradually faded as storytellers focused more on dramatic narrative than on preserving ancient mythological patterns. Another comparison strengthens this broader interpretation of the Arthurian cycle. Just as math serves as the wise guide, protector, and supernatural authority behind Gwydion in Welsh mythology, Merlin fulfills a remarkably similar function in Arthur's story. Merlin provides knowledge unavailable to ordinary people, directs the course of events, reveals hidden truths, and repeatedly shapes the destiny of the king. Although the names and settings differ, both figures occupy almost identical positions within their respective mythological traditions. Throughout this discussion, Arthur has been treated primarily as a culture hero, a legendary figure remembered for establishing order, introducing customs, and guiding civilization rather than simply ruling a kingdom. This interpretation explains many aspects of his legend, including the Round Table, his journeys into the Otherworld, and his role as protector of Britain. It also fits naturally with the broader pattern found in Celtic mythology, where extraordinary heroes often serve as founders of institutions and guardians of cultural traditions. There is, however, another possibility. Arthur may originally have occupied an even higher position within Celtic belief. Rather than being a culture hero, he may once have functioned as a supreme divine figure comparable to Zeus in Greek mythology. If this interpretation were correct, many of the relationships and stories surrounding him would need to be understood in an entirely different framework. His adventures, his family, and even his conflicts with other legendary figures would belong not to the mythology of heroic founders, but to the mythology of the gods themselves. Although this alternative cannot be dismissed outright, the evidence appears to favor the first explanation. Arthur's surviving legends consistently emphasize his role as lawgiver, protector, explorer, and civilizing king far more often than they portray him as the supreme ruler of a divine pantheon. For that reason, viewing the mythical Arthur as a culture hero continues to provide the most coherent interpretation of the traditions that have survived from medieval Wales and the wider Celtic world. Irish mythology traces the origins of the Gaelic people to two legendary brothers, Eibbe and Erimon, the sons of Miel, a heroic ancestor whose name is associated with warfare. Their story resembles the Roman legend of Romulus and Remus, as the younger brother ultimately triumphs over the elder and becomes the founder of a new ruling line. Eibbe is often linked to Ireland's earlier inhabitants, while Erimon represents the Celtic newcomers who eventually established dominance across the island. One of the most famous rulers descended from this line was Eochaid Eirem, remembered as a legendary High King of Ireland. His surname connects him with farming and the cultivation of the land, suggesting that later tradition viewed him as a ruler who introduced or strengthened agricultural practices. During his reign, the royal assembly and great feast at Tara became one of the kingdom's most important traditions. When Eochaid sought a queen, his messengers discovered the beautiful Etain, a woman whose beauty became legendary throughout Ireland. She claimed to come from the supernatural world and agreed to marry the king, becoming queen at Tara. However, her past soon returned to haunt her. Medea, a powerful lord of the otherworld, revealed that Etain had once been his wife before magic, and jealousy separated them in an earlier existence. Medea repeatedly tried to persuade Etain to return with him, but she refused to leave Eochaid without her husband's permission. Unable to convince her directly, he challenged the king to games of strategy. After losing one contest and completing difficult tasks demanded by Eochaid, Medea challenged him again. This time, the king was defeated, and Medea claimed his reward, the right to embrace and kiss the queen before the royal court. Believing the request harmless, Eochaid agreed. Yet when Medea finally embraced Etain, he used his supernatural power to carry her away before anyone could stop him. The two vanished from Tara, taking the form of swans as they disappeared into the otherworld. Determined to recover his queen, Eochaid searched unsuccessfully for a year. At last, his druid used magical knowledge to discover that Etain was hidden inside Medea's fairy dwelling. The king gathered the warriors of Ireland and marched against the enchanted mound, forcing the inhabitants of the otherworld to surrender Etain and return her to the world of humans. The legend combines themes of kingship, love, magic, and the conflict between the mortal world and the supernatural realm. It also reflects the importance of Tara as Ireland's symbolic royal center, while portraying the otherworld as a place whose inhabitants could still influence the lives and destinies of earthly rulers. The earlier life of Etain survives only in scattered fragments, yet the surviving traditions reveal a remarkable story. At the beginning of the legend, she belongs to Medea, the powerful ruler of the otherworld. Their happiness is shattered by a jealous rival who succeeds in separating them. Afterward, Etain becomes the companion of another divine figure known as the Mac Ok, but the same rival once again destroys their union through magic and deception. As punishment, or perhaps as the result of powerful enchantment, Etain is transformed into a tiny fly and wanders helplessly across Ireland for 7 long years. Blown wherever the winds carry her, she endures loneliness and hardship until chance finally changes her fate. During a feast in Ulster, she lands unnoticed inside the golden drinking cup of the wife of a nobleman named Etar. Without realizing what has happened, the woman drinks the enchanted creature. In time, Etain is reborn as the daughter of Etar and his queen. She grows into an exceptionally beautiful young woman, raised with every luxury expected of a princess. 50 noble maidens accompany her throughout her youth, emphasizing both her royal status and extraordinary beauty. As she matures, her appearance becomes so famous that people begin using her name as the standard by which all beauty is judged. One day, while Etain and her companions bathe near the coast, a mysterious stranger rides toward them. He possesses an almost supernatural appearance and after stopping nearby, sings a haunting song that recalls events from Etaine's forgotten past. His verses also predict that her beauty will one day bring conflict and suffering to Ireland. According to his prophecy, kings will wage war, fairy kingdoms will face destruction, and countless warriors will lose their lives because of her destiny. The stranger disappears as suddenly as he arrived, leaving only his unsettling prophecy behind. His words proved to be remarkably accurate. Etaine's later marriage to King Eochaid eventually leads to a bitter struggle between the High King and Medea, ruler of the Otherworld. Determined to recover his former wife, Medea draws Ireland into a conflict that forever damages the relationship between humans and the fairy world. The consequences of this quarrel continue long after the principal figures have vanished. Although Eochaid and Etain produce only a daughter, their descendants inherit the burden of the ancient dispute. Generations later, the famous High King Conaire the Great ultimately falls victim to the fairies' lingering desire for revenge. The supernatural world, unlike mankind, does not forget old injuries, and its vengeance can wait across centuries before finally striking. Stories of delayed revenge are not unique to Irish tradition. Similar ideas appear in Welsh folklore, where fairy beings punish descendants for offenses committed by their ancestors many generations earlier. Such legends reflect a common Celtic belief that supernatural powers possess endless patience and remember every violation of their sacred places. Etaine's repeated rebirth raises another fascinating question. According to the chronology of the legend, an immense span of time separates her first existence from the life in which she becomes the daughter of Étar. Rather than treating this as ordinary reincarnation, many scholars believe the story reflects a symbolic cycle found throughout Celtic mythology. A useful comparison appears in the legends surrounding Cú Chulainn. He is frequently described as an earthly manifestation of the god Lugh, the great solar deity. Since the sun rises anew each day, a god associated with it could naturally be imagined as returning to life again and again. Etain appears to follow a similar pattern, although her symbolism points not toward the sun itself, but toward another recurring phenomenon of nature. The legend makes the greatest sense if Etain represents the dawn. Every morning, the dawn seems to be born from darkness, crosses the sky in radiant beauty, and gradually fades back into night. Seen from this perspective, the struggle between her earthly husband Eochaid and the otherworld ruler Medea becomes a symbolic contest between the worlds of light and darkness, each claiming the same celestial figure for part of the day. This interpretation also explains why Etain repeatedly appears in different forms. Sometimes she is reborn directly into the world, while elsewhere, another Etain is introduced simply as the natural daughter of Eochaid and his queen. Similar variations appear in the traditions about Cú Chulainn, who is described in different sources either as Lugh's son or as the god reborn in human form. Mythology often allows both ideas to exist side by side without contradiction. Another striking parallel links the two legends. Before entering the human world, both Etain and Lugh assume the form of a tiny fly and are unknowingly swallowed by the women destined to become their mothers. Such unusual births emphasize that these figures belong simultaneously to both the divine and mortal realms. Even Etain's name appears to reinforce this interpretation. It is commonly associated with brightness or shining light, while another of her names means the fair or white woman. Both titles suit a goddess identified with the first light of morning, whose appearance transforms darkness into day. King Eochaid himself also presents several puzzles. Irish tradition sometimes gives him a brother named Ailill, and in other versions, another brother called Eochaid Fedlech. Some texts even treat these names as referring to the same individual. These inconsistencies suggest that different traditions gradually merged over time, producing conflicting family relationships that later storytellers attempted to reconcile. His surname, Airem, has generated similar confusion. Some sources preserve it in slightly different forms, eventually encouraging medieval writers to treat what may originally have been a single legendary ruler as two entirely separate kings. As genealogies became increasingly elaborate, small linguistic differences developed into completely independent historical traditions. Although Eokid is commonly remembered by the title Irem, often translated as the Plowman, the legend itself suggests a broader meaning. The story never says that he introduced plowing to Ireland. Instead, it explains that while watching the supernatural beings build a great causeway, he noticed a new method of yoking cattle by their necks and shoulders. The people of Ireland had never used this technique before, and Eokid adopted it for his own kingdom. This suggests that Éirinn originally referred not simply to a farmer, but to someone who harnessed or directed teams of animals. The later meaning of plowman may therefore represent only a narrower interpretation of an older title. This episode closely resembles another famous theme in the Arthurian legends. Just as Medea searched for Queen Etain before carrying her back to the otherworld, Arthur's own queen is repeatedly portrayed as being taken away by another man. In some traditions, she is seized by Mordred, while in others, she departs with Melwas after he has patiently waited for an entire year. Although the settings differ, both stories revolve around a powerful ruler losing his queen to a rival connected with a different world or kingdom. An even more intriguing similarity appears in the Welsh triads. Instead of describing Arthur as the husband of a single Guinevere, they speak of 3 women, all bearing exactly the same name. At first glance, this appears strange, but the Irish legend of Etain provides an explanation. Just as Irish tradition preserves 3 different manifestations of Etain, Welsh tradition seems to remember 3 versions of Guinevere. The later romances ignore this entirely, almost certainly because multiple queens with the same identity would have complicated the narrative and weakened the emotional focus of the story. Their absence from later literature therefore suggests that the triads preserve a much older layer of Celtic mythology. Each Guinevere is given a different father. One is the daughter of Greed of Gwent, another of Gwythyr, son of Greidiol, and the third of Ogivan the Giant. These fathers appear to represent different supernatural forces. Ogivan belongs to the ancient powers associated with the earth, while Gwythyr is connected with light and summer through his eternal struggle against Gwyn, the ruler of death and darkness. The symbolism closely mirrors the 3 generations of Etain in Irish mythology, where the same divine figure repeatedly appears in new forms. The comparison does not end there. Celtic tradition also preserves more than one woman named Iseult. The best known is the wife of King Mark, whose tragic love affair with Tristan became one of medieval Europe's greatest romances. After Tristan loses her, however, he later marries another woman who also bears the name Iseult. Medieval writers distinguish them as Iseult the Fair and Iseult of the White Hands, yet both are described as exceptionally beautiful and gifted healers. This duplication resembles the multiple Guineveres and the multiple Etains, suggesting that all 3 traditions may preserve the same ancient mythological pattern. Guinevere's own name appears to support this interpretation. The first element clearly means white or fair, while the second is probably related to old Celtic words referring to spirits, ghosts, or supernatural beings. Rather than simply meaning a beautiful woman, the name may originally have signified a white apparition or radiant supernatural woman, closely matching Etain's titles, which also emphasize brightness, whiteness, and shining beauty. Another revealing comparison concerns the names Mordred and Medea. Linguistically, they appear to share the same ancient root. Welsh tradition even remembers a legendary archer named Medea, whose extraordinary accuracy made him famous. Like Medea, he possessed almost superhuman skill. Such similarities suggest that the names were not chosen by chance, but belong to a much older mythological tradition in which certain heroic or supernatural qualities were associated with them. The strongest connection, however, lies between the names Arthur and Éirinn themselves. Careful linguistic study indicates that both may ultimately derive from ancient Celtic words connected with agriculture and cultivation. While Éirinn developed into a title associated with harnessing animals and eventually plowing, Arthur may descend from an equally old Celtic word meaning plowman, cultivator, or one who prepares the land. Similar words survive in Lithuanian, Old Prussian, Slavic, Germanic, Greek, and Latin, showing that the idea belongs to a very ancient Indo-European vocabulary rather than to Celtic alone. Evidence from Roman Gaul strengthens this possibility. Inscriptions mention divine figures whose names carry the same linguistic root and who are associated with cultivation and civilized life. One title attached to the Roman god Mercury appears to describe him as a protector of agriculture and cultivation. Since Arthur has repeatedly been interpreted as a Celtic culture hero, a legendary figure who brings knowledge, order, and civilization to humanity, this connection becomes especially significant. Arthur's name may once have carried a meaning similar to the Irish title Éireann, not simply plowman, but someone who binds, harnesses, organizes, or directs. This interpretation becomes especially interesting when Arthur's role in Culhwch and Olwen is examined. In the Irish story, Eochaid Éireann does not personally work the fields. Instead, he forces supernatural beings to complete difficult tasks and learns from them a new way of yoking cattle. Arthur behaves in much the same way. When Culhwch seeks permission to marry Olwen, her father Ysbyddaden imposes a long series of nearly impossible conditions. Culhwch accepts them, but it is Arthur who provides the warriors, magical creatures, craftsmen, and divine assistants needed to complete them. The first and most important challenge is agricultural. An enormous hill must be cleared, burned, plowed, planted, and made to produce ripe wheat in a single day so that food and drink can be prepared for the wedding. Ordinary farmers cannot accomplish this. The task requires a Maithon, a divine cultivator, and Gavanan, the supernatural smith who must maintain the plowing equipment. Even these figures are not enough. Several extraordinary pairs of oxen must also be found and yoked together. Some live on opposite sides of distant mountains, while others were once human beings transformed into cattle as punishment for their sins. Arthur must obtain them through persuasion, authority, or force. The remaining demands include harvesting flax, preparing a unique ceremonial drink, and securing vessels strong enough to preserve it. The famous rescue of Mabon and the hunt for the monstrous boar Twerk Trith are only part of this larger sequence. Arthur's true importance lies in his ability to gather every necessary person, animal, object, and supernatural power into a single organized effort. This makes his agricultural connection stronger than that of Eochaid Éireann. Arthur is not shown plowing with his own hands, but he directs the entire operation. He brings together farmers, smiths, animals, warriors, and magical helpers, allowing impossible work to be completed. In that sense, his name may describe one who harnesses forces rather than merely harnessing oxen. The original meaning may have extended far beyond farming. A figure who binds or joins can unite animals beneath a yoke, warriors beneath a commander, people within a court, or words within a speech. This broader idea suits Arthur's role as a culture hero. He creates order by gathering scattered powers and directing them toward a common purpose. Welsh tradition occasionally presents Arthur as a poet or bard, just as it does Gwydion. This may connect him with another aspect of the ancient culture hero, mastery of speech and persuasion. In Celtic mythology, eloquence could be imagined as a form of binding power, capable of drawing people together and controlling them without physical force. Similar ideas appear in the Gaulish figure, Ogmios, whose authority is expressed through language. Arthur may therefore have been remembered not only as a military ruler, but also as someone who organized society through command, poetry, law, and persuasion. The linguistic evidence remains uncertain because the ancient root associated with Arthur and Éireann developed many different meanings. It could refer to joining, holding, guiding, harnessing, speaking, or leading. Yet all these ideas share a common principle, bringing separate things together and controlling their movement. Éireann also resembles the Sanskrit name Aryaman, a term connected with companionship, social bonds, and marriage. Aryaman was also the name of an ancient Indo-Iranian god associated with alliances and relationships between people. This comparison does not provide a complete explanation, but it supports the idea that the title may originally have concerned social order rather than agriculture alone. Seen in this way, Arthur's importance becomes clearer. His legendary strength lies not simply in combat, but in his power to unite others. He gathers heroes into one court, organizes impossible expeditions, commands supernatural beings, and directs the forces required to transform wildland into a place of abundance. Arthur may therefore have begun as a divine organizer, a figure who harnessed animals, people, language, and supernatural power. The later king of the Round Table would then be the medieval form of a much older Celtic culture hero whose central gift was the creation of order from chaos. The comparison between Arthur and the Irish figure Airem may seem complicated, especially because it relies in part on language and etymology. Yet the similarities are not limited to ancient words. In some traditions, the two legendary cycles appear to have blended so completely that the characters from Airem's story were replaced by Arthurian figures without changing the basic plot. One striking example comes from eastern Scotland, particularly the region between Perthshire and Forfarshire. Across this area are numerous places bearing Arthur's name, including Arthur's Stone, Arthur's Fold, and Arthur's Seat. Local tradition also speaks of a great battle fought there between Arthur and the Pictish ruler Loth, or his son Mordred, a conflict in which Arthur was said to have met his end. Nearby stands Barry Hill, where the remains of an ancient hill fort gave rise to another remarkable legend. According to local belief, Mordred kept Queen Guinevere, known in the area as Wanda, as his companion after defeating Arthur. When Arthur eventually recovered her, he was overcome with anger and ordered her execution. A famous carved stone in the village of Magel was long believed to mark her grave, and the story remained part of local folklore for centuries. Even travelers in the 18th century recorded hearing villagers recount the tragic fate of Queen Wanda. These Scottish traditions differ noticeably from the better-known Arthurian romances. In some versions, Wanda is not simply an unfaithful queen, but a dangerous giantess or supernatural woman. Such details resemble the Irish traditions surrounding Etain far more closely than the familiar medieval stories about Guinevere. This suggests that the older Irish myth may have survived in Scotland before gradually acquiring Arthurian names. The distribution of these legends also raises an interesting question. Arthurian stories are abundant in this small region of Scotland, yet they are largely absent from the surrounding areas. Since there is little evidence that Brythonic-speaking peoples dominated this part of the country, the presence of so many Arthurian traditions seems unusual. A likely explanation is that these stories originally belonged to the Goidelic-speaking inhabitants of the region and were based on legends about Airem. As Arthurian romances spread through Britain during the Middle Ages, storytellers simply replaced the older names with the now famous figures of Arthur, Guinevere, and Mordred. The underlying narrative remained essentially the same, but its characters became those of the Arthurian world. This process would explain why an apparently isolated group of Arthurian traditions exists in a region otherwise lacking strong Brythonic influence. Rather than representing an independent Arthurian tradition, these legends may preserve older Irish myth beneath a later medieval appearance. At the same time, another Arthur seems to have existed alongside the historical one. This second Arthur belonged not to history, but to mythology. Whether his name originated from the Latin Artorius or from an older Celtic divine name, both forms eventually produced the familiar Welsh Arthur. Because the historical commander and the mythical figure shared the same name, their identities gradually merged until separating them became almost impossible. Among the Brythons, this ancient supernatural figure was remembered as Arthur, while among the Goidelic peoples, he appears to have survived under the name Airem. Some evidence even suggests that he corresponds to a Celtic form of Mercury worshipped in ancient Gaul, a deity associated not only with skill and leadership, but also with civilization and the development of human society. If this interpretation is correct, Arthur's deepest significance lies not merely in kingship or warfare, but in his role as a culture hero. He represents the legendary bringer of knowledge, organization, craftsmanship, and agriculture, qualities that appear repeatedly throughout Celtic mythology. Long before he became the ruler of Camelot, he may have symbolized the civilizing power that transformed wilderness into ordered society. The Arthur remembered in medieval romance, therefore, may actually be the product of two different traditions. One was a real warrior who fought during the uncertain years after the Roman withdrawal from Britain. The other was a far older divine figure whose myths stretched back into the earliest layers of Celtic religion. Over the centuries, these two identities fused into a single legendary king. What survives today is only a fragment of that original mythological being, a towering figure whose full story disappeared with the lost world of the ancient Celtic gods. So far, Arthur has remained at the center of the discussion, but his queen deserves equal attention. In Welsh tradition, her name is Gwenhwyfar, while medieval French and English romances transformed it into Guinevere and several other variations. Curiously, although later versions of her name became common in some parts of Britain, the original Welsh name gradually acquired a negative reputation. In Welsh folklore, naming a daughter Gwenhwyfar was often considered unfortunate because the legendary queen had long been associated with betrayal and moral weakness. This reputation appears to be extremely old. Medieval Welsh lore even mentions that when the queen requested music in the royal chamber, the court bard was expected to sing about the Battle of Camelot, but quietly enough not to disturb the rest of the hall. The choice of subject was hardly accidental. Camelot represented the tragic consequences of Guinevere's unfaithfulness and served as a warning against similar behavior. Exactly how Guinevere earned this reputation, however, is far from clear. Geoffrey of Monmouth accuses her of accepting Mordred after Arthur's downfall, but he gives little indication that she acted willingly. Other traditions describe her as being abducted rather than choosing to leave. Welsh literature generally assumes her guilt without explaining it in detail, suggesting that earlier stories emphasizing her conduct may simply have disappeared over time. Unlike the later French romances, Welsh tradition knows nothing of the famous love affair between Guinevere and Lancelot. That relationship became one of the central themes of continental Arthurian literature, but appears to have been a medieval addition rather than part of the earliest Celtic mythology. The older legends instead focus on a recurring pattern in which Arthur's queen is repeatedly carried away by supernatural or hostile rulers. From a mythological perspective, these kidnappings symbolize something much older than human adultery. They reflect the ancient struggle between light and darkness, in which the ruler of the underworld seizes the radiant goddess associated with dawn and evening light. Just as the god of darkness was believed to overcome the sun, he was also imagined as capturing the goddess whose beauty illuminated the world. Besides Mordred, the most important figure connected with this theme is Melwas. His name appears in many different forms across medieval literature, eventually becoming names such as Meleagant and Meleagrance. Linguistically, the name probably describes an eternally youthful prince, an image that closely resembles Medea, the youthful ruler of the Irish otherworld despite his immense age. One of the oldest surviving versions of the story appears in the life of St. Gildas. There, Melwas rules a kingdom identified with Somerset. After secretly waiting for an entire year, he finally finds an opportunity to seize Guinevere and carries her away to the heavily fortified island of Glastonbury, protected by marshes and surrounding waters. Arthur marches with his armies to rescue her, but before bloodshed can occur, peace is arranged through the mediation of St. Gildas, and the queen is returned to her husband. Later, romances transform this relatively simple narrative into a much larger adventure. In Mallory's account, Guinevere announces that she and her ladies will celebrate the arrival of spring by riding into the countryside near Westminster. Dressed in green and accompanied by the Knights of the Round Table, the royal party enjoys the festivities until Melwas suddenly attacks with an overwhelming force. Unable to resist, Guinevere and her companions are taken prisoner and carried to his castle. The romance explains that Melwas had loved the queen for many years, but had never dared to act while Lancelot remained near her. Seizing his opportunity during Lancelot's absence, he finally accomplished the kidnapping he had long planned. Once the news reaches Lancelot, he immediately rides in pursuit. Along the way, his horse is killed, forcing him to continue on foot. Eventually, he commandeers a cart belonging to Melwas and uses it to reach the enemy's stronghold. After defeating Melwas in single combat, Lancelot frees Guinevere and restores her to Arthur. further establishing himself as the greatest knight of the Round Table. Chrétien de Troyes develops the story even further, but in doing so preserves one of its oldest mythological features. Melwase's kingdom is described not as an ordinary country, but as a land from which no traveler ever returns. Those who enter remain there forever as captives and exiles. Such a description leaves little doubt that this mysterious realm originally represented the Celtic otherworld, the land of death rather than a human kingdom. In this form, the legend closely resembles many ancient myths. Guinevere's abduction recalls the story of Persephone being carried into the underworld by Hades, while Arthur's effort to recover her echoes the attempt of Orpheus to rescue Eurydice. The medieval romances transformed these ancient themes into tales of chivalry, but the mythological foundation remained clearly visible. The routes leading into Melwase's realm reinforce this interpretation. Chrétien describes two extraordinary bridges. One is a narrow bridge surrounded by water on every side, while the other consists of the razor-sharp edge of a sword stretching across an impossible distance. One path is attempted by Gawain, the other by Lancelot. These supernatural crossings closely resemble bridges found in medieval visions of the afterlife, where souls must cross dangerous paths to reach the world beyond. Similar images appear in Irish religious literature, the legends of St. Patrick's Purgatory, and many other European traditions. They all express the same symbolic idea: the realm of the dead can be reached only by passing a perilous boundary separating ordinary life from the supernatural. Welsh tradition preserves another version of this motif in a tale involving Gwalchmai. On his journey to the court of King Pellew, he encounters three magical bridges crossing a vast stretch of water. One is called the Bridge of the Eel. At first, it appears impossibly narrow, but the moment Gwalchmai courageously rides onto it, the bridge miraculously widens until it becomes broad enough for several wagons to cross together. The river beneath this bridge was no ordinary stream. In Welsh tradition, it is connected with a mysterious supernatural current that circles the world, sometimes imagined as a serpent-like or rainbow river separating the lands of the living from the hidden realm beyond. Like the sword bridge and the water bridge of the French romances, it preserves another memory of the ancient Celtic belief that the otherworld could only be reached by crossing a dangerous and enchanted passage. Chrétien de Troyes' account of Melwase preserves one of the oldest and most intriguing layers of the Arthurian tradition. His description of Melwase's kingdom as the land from which no one returns is especially significant. Although this detail largely disappeared from the surviving Welsh versions, it suggests that Arthur's journey to rescue his queen was never intended as an ordinary military campaign. Instead, it was originally a mythological descent into the otherworld. Echoes of this older tradition also survive in a mysterious Welsh dialogue whose meaning puzzled scholars for centuries. In the poem, Arthur meets the captive Gwenhwyfar. Arthur proudly declares that his black horse fears neither water nor any warrior, while Gwenhwyfar challenges his courage and even pretends not to recognize him. Arthur confidently insists that he can overcome every obstacle placed before him. Later in the conversation, Gwenhwyfar remarks that she has seen Arthur before, serving wine at his great hall in Devon, and Arthur confirms her memory. At first glance, the exchange appears ordinary, but it may preserve fragments of a much older story. Arthur's fearless horse and his willingness to cross dangerous waters strongly suggest a connection with the supernatural bridges that led into Melwase's mysterious realm. Perhaps the most surprising feature of the dialogue is Gwenhwyfar's admiration for Kay rather than Arthur. She praises Kay as the true warrior and implies that Arthur could never equal him. This portrayal differs sharply from the better-known Arthurian romances. Some scholars have therefore suggested that, in an earlier version of the legend, Gwenhwyfar's captor may not have been Melwase at all, but Kay himself. Other Welsh traditions support this possibility. Kay is remembered not only as Arthur's companion, but also as a powerful rival who eventually wages war against him before withdrawing to a fortress beyond the sea. The most remarkable episode involving Kay concerns the death of Arthur's son, Lacw. Early Welsh poems and the triads describe Lacw as an exceptionally wise and noble hero, yet the Welsh version of the Grail legend presents a far more mythical account of his death. Lachau defeats the giant Logrin, one of Arthur's greatest enemies. Following an old custom, he falls asleep upon the body of the slain giant. While he sleeps, Kay arrives, secretly cuts off Lachau's head, hides the body, and carries the giant's head back to Arthur's court, claiming the victory as his own. At first, Kay is celebrated as a hero. Eventually, however, Arthur and Gwenhwyfar discover his treachery. Exposed and disgraced, Kay abandons the kingdom and takes refuge in a fortified castle beyond the sea, becoming Arthur's enemy. Lachau himself appears to be much more than an ordinary prince. He wears a golden circlet as a sign of royal birth, possesses extraordinary knowledge of the natural world, and even his name is closely related to ancient Welsh words meaning bright, radiant, or shining. These details strongly suggest that he originally represented a solar hero rather than a historical figure. His strange habit of sleeping upon the body of every giant he defeated also makes sense when viewed as mythology. The giant symbolizes the forces of darkness. Once defeated, his enormous body becomes the ocean itself, and the victorious sun comes to rest upon it at sunset. Even today, French preserves a faint memory of this ancient image in the expression "Le soleil va se coucher," the sun goes to sleep. Eventually, however, darkness returns. Night overcomes the sun once more, and the solar hero falls. In the story of Lachau, this cosmic cycle is represented by Kay's betrayal. What appears to be the murder of a prince is, at a deeper level, another expression of the eternal struggle between light and darkness that lies beneath many of the oldest Celtic myths. Kay's role in the Arthurian legends becomes much clearer when we examine the earliest romances. In Chrétien de Troyes' version, Arthur is celebrating Ascension Day with a magnificent court when a mysterious knight suddenly arrives. The stranger announces that he holds many of Arthur's knights and ladies captive in a distant land from which no one ever returns. He offers only one way to free them. Arthur must allow a single knight to escort Queen Gwenhwyfar into a nearby forest where that knight will fight him for her. The entire court is stunned. At that moment, Kay approaches Arthur and pretends that he wishes to leave the king's service forever. Before departing, he asks for one final favor. Arthur agrees without knowing what Kay intends to request. To everyone's horror, Kay demands the right to escort the queen himself and face the mysterious challenger. Bound by his promise, Arthur has no choice but to accept. Gwenhwyfar reluctantly rides into the forest with Kay, while Gwalchmai secretly follows from a distance. Lancelot arrives too late to prevent the duel. Kay is badly wounded, and Melwas, the mysterious knight, captures both the queen and Kay before escaping toward his hidden kingdom. Lancelot immediately gives chase, but soon loses his horse. Forced to continue on foot, he encounters a dwarf driving a cart. The dwarf refuses to answer any questions unless Lancelot climbs into the cart. Although doing so would disgrace any knight, Lancelot accepts without hesitation. Gwalchmai continues on horseback while Lancelot endures the humiliation, determined to rescue the queen regardless of his reputation. The two knights eventually separate. Gwalchmai attempts to enter Melwas's realm through the water bridge, while Lancelot chooses the far more dangerous sword bridge. After enduring numerous hardships and defeating many enemies, Lancelot finally reaches Melwas's stronghold. There he defeats Melwas in combat, aided by the intervention of Melwas's just and honorable father, King Bademagu. As a result, Gwenhwyfar and all the captives imprisoned in that strange kingdom are finally set free. Yet the reunion is far from joyful. Instead of thanking her rescuer, Gwenhwyfar greets Lancelot with cold silence and refuses to speak to him. Kay, meanwhile, grows bitter that Lancelot has succeeded where he himself had failed. Matters become even more complicated when Melwas accuses Kay of secretly visiting the queen during one of the nights spent in his castle. Kay denies the charge, and in Chrétien's version, he is actually telling the truth, for it was Lancelot, not Kay, who secretly entered the queen's chamber after she had forgiven him. As the story draws to a close, Gwenhwyfar and Gwalchmai safely return to Arthur's court, but Lancelot disappears once again. Melwas captures him through deception and imprisons him in a hidden fortress. Eventually, Melwas's own sister frees the captive knight, allowing Lancelot to challenge Melwas one final time in order to defend Gwenhwyfar's honor. Their duel ends with Lancelot striking a fatal blow that splits Melwas's skull and leaves him dead upon the battlefield. When this romance is compared with the old Welsh dialogue between Arthur and Gwenhwyfar, and with the Irish tale of Maida and Etain, an older layer of mythology begins to emerge. Gwenhwyfar's cold treatment of Lancelot mirrors her behavior in the Welsh poem, where she pretends not to recognize Arthur and even claims that Kay is the greater warrior. Once Melwas is set aside, several puzzling details remain. Kay's jealousy of Lancelot, the accusation that Kay had been too intimate with the Queen, and Arthur's reluctant agreement to allow Kay to escort Gwenhwyfar into danger. These elements closely resemble the Irish legend in which King Echaid unknowingly gives Maida permission to embrace Queen Etain, only to watch helplessly as the fairy king carries her away before the entire royal court. The similarities suggest that Chrétien was probably working with two different versions of the same ancient myth. Rather than preserving one consistent tradition, he combined separate stories into a single romance. This explains why some scenes fit together imperfectly, while others preserve unmistakable traces of a much older Celtic narrative. Melwas himself continued to appear in later Welsh poetry. In the 14th century, the poet Dafydd ap Gwilym compared his own frustrated attempts to reach his beloved with Melwas's legendary visit to Gwenhwyfar. Standing outside a lady's window on a cold night, he laments that, unlike Melwas, he cannot gain entrance or win the woman he loves. The comparison suggests that, in one Welsh tradition, Melwas entered Gwenhwyfar's chamber directly through a window in Arthur's palace before carrying her away. Another poem, traditionally attributed to Dafydd ap Gwilym, speaks of the sleep of Melwas beneath the green cloak. Some writers interpreted the phrase to mean that Melwas disguised himself in green clothing to blend in with Gwenhwyfar and her attendants, who had also dressed in green. A more convincing interpretation, however, is that the green cloak refers not to clothing at all, but to a woodland shelter or leafy bower where Melwas concealed his captive after abducting her. A 15th century Welsh poem develops this image even further. The poet longs to possess Melwas's magical skill, describing him as a thief who used enchantment to carry away a beautiful woman to the farthest edge of the world. He imagines Melwas climbing into a hidden refuge among the trees, where branches formed natural walls around his secret retreat. Whether this refuge stood high in the branches or upon a forested hill remains uncertain, but it clearly belonged to the mysterious landscape associated with the otherworld. Although Melwas is the best-known captor of Gwenhwyfar, he was not the only one. Other medieval romances replace him with figures such as Brun de Morois, Valerin, or Gassozyne. In Ulrich's Lanzele, for example, Valérine claims that Gwenhwyfar had originally been promised to him before Arthur married her. When Lancelot defeats him in single combat, Valérine refuses to abandon his claim. Later, during a royal hunt, he abducts the queen and carries her to a heavily fortified castle surrounded by an enchanted wilderness filled with monsters, serpents, and deadly creatures. Once again, the setting is not an ordinary kingdom, but a supernatural realm lying beyond the boundaries of the human world. Rescuing Queen Gwenhwyfar from Valérine's fortress proved far more difficult than defeating him in battle. According to the romance, the queen had been placed under a powerful magical sleep, making it impossible for her to escape on her own. Lancelot once again became the central figure in the rescue, leading the assault that finally broke Valérine's enchantments. Valérine was killed, but victory came at a cost. During the struggle, Gwalchmai and Geraint were captured by another enemy, the sorcerer Malduk. Only after Lancelot defeated this magician were the two heroes finally freed. A similar version of the story appears in the romance of Brun de Morois. One day, Gwenhwyfar rode out to watch a hunt, accompanied only by Edern, son of Nudd. Before Edern could defend her, Brun suddenly attacked and carried the queen away. Edern was unarmed and powerless to stop the abduction. Brun had loved Gwenhwyfar for more than 7 years, and at last he seized the opportunity he had long awaited. Placing the queen before him on horseback, he fled to his castle at Morois, a fortress surrounded by marshes and dense forests that made any direct assault virtually impossible. Brún himself is especially interesting because his name appears to preserve traces of an even older Celtic tradition. It closely resembles the Welsh expression Du Moroed, meaning the Black One of the Seas. Although medieval writers treated this as the name of a marvelous horse, it may originally have referred to a supernatural being connected with the sea and the otherworld. In Welsh mythology, Gwyn ap Nudd, the ruler of the otherworld, rides a mysterious black horse that seems closely related to this ancient figure. The importance of the black horse becomes even clearer in another Arthurian tale. While wandering alone, Peredur receives a magnificent dark-colored horse from a mysterious lady. The animal carries him with incredible speed through forests and valleys until it reaches a vast river. Just as Peredur prepares to cross, he makes the sign of the cross. Instantly, the horse collapses, lets out a terrifying cry, and leaps into the river, whose waters burst into flames as it disappears beneath the surface. The medieval author explains that the horse was actually the devil in disguise, and throughout Welsh folklore, the devil frequently appears as a jet black horse. Yet this Christian explanation was probably added much later. Beneath it survives a much older Celtic belief in supernatural horses that carried travelers between the human world and the realm of the dead. This idea becomes even more convincing when another important figure is considered. One of the oldest Celtic rulers of the otherworld was known as March, whose name literally means horse. In Irish tradition, he appears as Mór or Mark, while Welsh legends know him as March, son of Mercion. Medieval romances transformed him into King Mark of Cornwall, the rival of Tristan for Isolde's love. Despite being portrayed as a human king, older traditions remembered him with horse's ears, preserving a clear sign of his supernatural origins. Because of this, there was little difficulty for medieval storytellers in imagining the mysterious black horse of Moro as both an animal and a person. Depending on the story, the same ancient being could appear as a magical horse, a powerful king, or a monstrous creature that combined human and animal features. These different versions were probably already circulating long before the Arthurian romances were written. Even the description of Brún de Morois' enchanted garden seems to preserve fragments of this older mythology. Rather than inventing a completely new setting, the romance places Brún and the captive queen beneath a great tree in a beautiful garden filled with roses, lilies, and shady groves. Such an image closely resembles the ancient Indo-European vision of the otherworld, a timeless paradise ruled by its supernatural king, where beauty, enchantment, and captivity exist side by side. Among the most important warriors of Arthur's court was Peredur, known in Welsh tradition as Peredur of the Long Spear, and sometimes simply as Peredur the Fair. In the tale that bears his name, he is introduced as the youngest son of Evroc, ruler of the north. That northern setting may preserve an old mythological idea, since ancient British tradition often imagined the far north as a remote and dangerous land associated with spirits, darkness, and the dead. Peredur appears with different family histories in Welsh literature. One tradition names him as one of 3 children born to Uadil, along with his brother Gurgi and their sister Saindrec. This family seems strongly mythological. Saindrec is described as wing-headed, while Gurgi's name means something like man-dog. Such strange companions suggest that Peredur himself may originally have been a solar or supernatural hero. Welsh stories sometimes pair Peredur closely with Gurgi, though they rarely explain how the two differ. In one triad, they ride together to witness the funeral fire of Gwyndoliw. In another, they are deserted by their followers before battle and killed by a warrior from Dara. This final episode introduces a historical enemy and shows how memories of warfare between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons gradually became mixed with older legends. Gurgi himself developed into an even darker figure. In some stories, he became a savage monster who had learned to enjoy human flesh and demanded the death of a Welshman every day. His grotesque appearance and violent behavior resemble the monstrous brothers often given to heroic figures in Celtic myth. Peredur is also linked with a brother named Elidir, and Geoffrey of Monmouth unexpectedly makes Owain another of his brothers. According to Geoffrey, Peredur and Owain seized the kingdom of their elder brother and divided Britain between them. Owain ruled the lands south of the Humber, while Peredur controlled the north and Scotland. After their deaths, Ellidyr returned to power. This repeated cycle of defeat and restoration may preserve another ancient myth about the endless struggle between light and darkness. Whatever his mythological origins, Peredur may also preserve the memory of a real British warrior who fought against the Angles of northern England. Yet the best-known version of his story belongs firmly to romance and legend. Peredur's father and 6 older brothers were killed in wars and tournaments while he was still a child. Fearing that he would suffer the same fate, his mother withdrew with him to a lonely wilderness and raised him in complete isolation. He was never allowed to hear about weapons, warfare, or knighthood. As a result, Peredur grew up with extraordinary innocence. One day, he saw 2 deer standing near his mother's goats. Since they had no horns, he assumed that they were goats that had lived wild for so long that their horns had disappeared. He chased them down, forced them into the goats' shelter, and proudly announced what he had done. The episode appears humorous, but it also resembles childhood adventures told about other Celtic heroes, especially Cuchulainn. Peredur's sheltered life ended when 3 knights from Arthur's court passed near his home. Their armor and horses amazed him. When he asked his mother what they were, she desperately told him that they were angels. Instead of discouraging him, the answer filled him with excitement. Peredur immediately decided that he too would become an angel. He chose the strongest horse he could find, created a rough imitation of knightly equipment, and prepared to leave. His mother was devastated. Before he departed, she gave him a series of instructions about honorable behavior and directed him toward Arthur's court. His departure broke her heart, and she died soon afterward. After traveling for 2 days through forests and wilderness, Peredur found a tent belonging to a proud knight. The knight was absent, but his lady welcomed the young traveler and offered him food. Peredur behaved awkwardly because he knew nothing of courtly manners, yet his actions remained innocent and honorable. He eventually arrived at Arthur's court immediately after a humiliating incident. A mysterious knight had entered the hall, seized the queen's golden goblet, thrown wine over Gwenhwyfar, and challenged Arthur's warriors to fight him. None dared to respond, believing that anyone bold enough to insult the queen in such a way must possess extraordinary power. Peredur entered during this uncomfortable silence. His crude clothing and strange equipment caused the court to laugh, especially when he announced that he had come to Arthur to become a knight. Yet 2 dwarfs recognized him immediately. They had once served his family, and one of them suddenly greeted him as the greatest of warriors and the flower of knighthood. The greeting was especially remarkable because the dwarf had remained silent for an entire year. Kay, angered by his words, struck him to the ground. When the dwarf's female companion offered Peredur similar praise, Kay kicked her so violently that she appeared dead. Peredur witnessed the cruelty and quietly remembered it. When he asked to see Arthur, Kay mockingly ordered him to pursue the knight who had insulted the queen and recover the stolen goblet. Peredur accepted the challenge without hesitation. The mysterious warrior initially laughed at the inexperienced youth, but the encounter ended quickly. Peredur killed him and attempted to remove his armor without even knowing how it was fastened. Owain, concerned that Kay had sent an untrained boy into danger, followed Peredur and found the enemy already dead. Peredur took the fallen knight's weapons, armor, and horse as his own. However, he refused to return to Arthur's court. Instead, he gave the golden goblet to Owain and asked him to return it to Gwenhwyfar. He also sent Arthur a message. Peredur promised to remain loyal to the king, but he would not enter the court again until he had punished the tall man who had attacked the 2 dwarfs. That man was Kay. Thus, Peredur's first adventure ended not only with his transformation into a warrior, but also with a personal vow of revenge against one of Arthur's most famous companions. Peredur had not traveled far before he met one of Arthur's enemies. He defeated the knight, but spared his life on the condition that he go to Arthur's court, submit to the king, and deliver a warning. Peredur would not return until he had taken revenge on Kay. Over the course of a single week, Peredur defeated 16 more knights and sent each of them to repeat the same message. With every new arrival, Kay grew increasingly anxious. Continuing his journey, Peredur reached a lonely lake surrounded by wilderness. Beyond the water stood a magnificent castle. Its grey-haired and lame lord welcomed him warmly and revealed that he was Peredur's uncle, the brother of his mother. He declared that Peredur must remain there for a time to receive the education of a true knight. That evening, the old man tested Peredur's skill with a sword and immediately recognized his extraordinary potential. He began teaching him courtly manners, proper speech, and the discipline expected of a warrior. Most importantly, he gave Peredur one unusual rule. Whenever he witnessed something mysterious, he must never ask for an explanation. His teacher would tell him anything he needed to know. The next day, Peredur departed and soon reached the home of another maternal uncle. There his swordsmanship was tested again. This second uncle praised him as the finest swordsman in the kingdom, though he warned that Peredur had not yet reached the full measure of his power. During the evening, two young men entered carrying an enormous spear from which 3 streams of blood flowed onto the floor. Everyone in the hall began to weep, yet neither Peredur nor his uncle spoke of it. Soon afterward, 2 maidens appeared carrying a severed human head on a large platter surrounded by blood. Once again, the household cried out in grief. Remembering his lesson, Peredur asked no questions. These strange visions tested both his discipline and obedience. Yet his silence would later prove deeply important, for he had witnessed a mystery without seeking to understand it. After leaving the castle, Peredur encountered his foster sister. She blamed him bitterly for the death of his mother, who had died from grief after his departure. Her own husband had recently been killed by a powerful knight. Peredur defeated the murderer and forced him to marry and protect the widow. He then sent the defeated man to Arthur with the familiar warning that he would not return until Kay had been punished. Peredur next reached a castle belonging to a young noblewoman whose lands had been seized by a neighboring earl after she refused to marry him. Her foster brothers continued to defend her, but the castle was almost out of food and expected to be attacked the following morning. Despite her desperate situation, the lady received Peredur with generosity. Her brothers later pressured her to offer herself to him in return for his assistance. Ashamed and distressed, she refused, but her tears awakened Peredur. When she explained everything, he promised to help without demanding any reward. Within a few days, Peredur defeated the earl and his greatest warriors. He restored the lady's lands, secured compensation for her losses, and remained for 3 weeks to ensure that peace had truly returned. Soon afterward, he encountered the proud knight of the glade, whose tent Peredur had visited earlier in his journey. Convinced that Peredur had dishonored his lady, the jealous knight had forced her to wander with him while he searched for revenge. Although she repeatedly defended Peredur's innocence, he refused to believe her. Peredur quickly defeated him and forced him to admit publicly that the woman had done nothing wrong. The knight was also required to acknowledge that his defeat had served as compensation for the suffering he had caused her. Peredur then arrived at a mountain fortress threatened by the 9 witches of Gloucester. Its lady warned him that the witches attacked during the night and urged him to seek safer lodging. Peredur refused to leave and insisted on defending the castle. Before dawn, he heard a violent struggle and rushed outside with his sword. One of the witches was attacking a guard. Peredur struck her helmet so hard that it flattened beneath the blow. The witch immediately begged him to spare her and called him by name. When Peredur demanded to know how she recognized him, she replied that destiny had revealed his identity. She foretold that he would bring suffering to the witches, but would also receive weapons, a horse, and advanced training from them. Peredur agreed to spare her on the condition that the witches never attack the castle again. He traveled with them to their hidden court and remained there for 3 weeks. They taught him how to ride with greater skill and how to master every kind of weapon. This stage of his education resembles the training of the Irish hero Cú Chulainn under the warrior woman Scathach. In both traditions, a dangerous supernatural woman becomes the hero's greatest instructor only after he first proves that he can defeat her. After leaving the witches, Peredur spent the night with a hermit. The next morning, he rode through a landscape covered in fresh snow. There he saw drops of blood from a wounded bird scattered across the white ground while a black raven stood nearby. The three colors immediately reminded him of the woman he loved. Her skin was as pale as the snow, her hair as dark as the raven's feathers, and her cheeks as red as the blood. Lost in thought, Peredur stopped moving and rested silently upon his long spear. Arthur and his warriors, who had been searching for him, saw the motionless knight in the distance. One man was sent to question him, but Peredur did not respond. When the warrior struck him, Peredur calmly knocked him from his horse and returned to his thoughts. The same happened to 24 more knights. At last, Kay approached and treated Peredur with his usual arrogance. This time, Peredur's anger finally erupted. He struck Kay so fiercely that the knight fell unconscious and badly injured. His riderless horse returned to Arthur's camp, causing great alarm among the company. Still, Peredur remained lost in his vision until Gwalchmai approached. Unlike the others, Gwalchmai spoke with courtesy and understanding. He recognized the poetic meaning of Peredur's meditation and gently encouraged him to answer. The two heroes finally introduced themselves and immediately formed a lasting friendship. Gwalchmai then escorted Peredur back to Arthur's camp. Peredur went willingly, especially after learning that the knight he had finally punished was the same Kay who had insulted him and abused the dwarfs at Arthur's court. Arthur and Gwenhwyfar welcomed Peredur with great honor, but his first evening at Caerleon soon changed the course of his life. There he met Ingharad of the Golden Hand and immediately fell deeply in love with her. When he confessed his feelings, however, she rejected him completely and declared that she would never love him. Wounded by her response, Peredur made a reckless vow. He swore that he would not speak to any Christian until Ingharad admitted that she loved him above all other men. The next morning, he left Arthur's court and wandered alone into an unknown country. His journey brought him to a place called the Round Valley, guarded by a fierce lion. The bones of its victims lay scattered nearby, but Peredur killed the beast and continued into the valley. There he found a castle ruled by a large grey-haired man who welcomed him with apparent kindness. During the evening, however, the ruler's daughter secretly warned Peredur that her father intended to murder him at dawn. She helped place his horse and weapons within reach. When the grey man and his followers attacked the next morning, Peredur defeated them easily. He spared the ruler only after forcing him to promise that he would submit to Arthur and accept baptism. Since the people of the valley were pagans, Peredur was relieved that speaking to them had not broken his vow. He next encountered a monstrous serpent that guarded a golden ring and had devastated the surrounding country for miles. After a difficult struggle, Peredur killed the creature and claimed the ring. Yet his long silence and separation from Arthur's court gradually weakened him. He missed his companions and continued to suffer because of his love for Ingharad. At last, he returned to Caerleon, disguised as a silent knight. Before reaching the court, he encountered Arthur's warriors under Kay's command. Kay demanded to know who he was. When Peredur gave no answer, Kay attacked and wounded him badly in the thigh. Peredur refused to fight back because doing so might reveal his identity. Owain, angered by Kay's cruelty, carried the injured stranger to Gwenhwyfar, who arranged for him to be healed. Soon afterward, a mysterious knight arrived at Arthur's court and challenged anyone present to fight him. The silent Peredur accepted and defeated him. The same thing happened every day for an entire week. Each challenger was overcome, yet no one discovered the identity of the unknown warrior. Finally, Arthur decided to face the next opponent himself. Before the king could mount, Peredur took Arthur's horse and rode onto the field. The challenger struck first, but could not move him. Peredur then lifted the knight completely out of his saddle and hurled him across the ground. The entire court admired the silent champion, but Ingharad was especially moved. She declared that it was tragic that such a brave warrior could not speak. Then she admitted that if he possessed a voice, she could love him above every other man, and that perhaps she already loved him despite his silence. These words released Peredur from his oath. He spoke at once, revealed his identity, and returned Ingharad's love. Only then did the court realize that the mysterious knight was Peredur. He remained for a time among Arthur's companions, especially Owain and Gwalchmai. This episode closely resembles a story told about Owain. After losing his reason and living among wild animals, Owain reached the estate of a widowed noblewoman in a state of complete exhaustion. Her servant restored his health with a magical ointment, and he remained in the castle until his strength returned. When a neighboring lord attacked the widow and attempted to seize her last remaining fortress, Owain rode into the enemy army, captured the earl, and brought him back as a prisoner. The defeated ruler was forced to restore all the widow's lands and compensate her for the damage he had caused. In both stories, a broken hero is healed by women before defending their home and honor. Peredur's adventures soon resumed. While hunting with Arthur's household, he followed his hound into a deserted region and reached the castle of a one-eyed robber known as the Arrogant Black Man. Peredur killed him and freed the young men and women held captive in the fortress. The prisoners offered him the robber's enormous wealth and his choice among the women, but Peredur refused both. Instead, he asked about another mysterious place known as the Court of the King of Suffering. When he arrived there, he witnessed a disturbing sight. A horse entered the castle carrying a dead knight. A woman washed the body and rubbed it with a precious ointment, after which the knight returned to life. 2 more dead warriors arrived and were restored in the same way. Peredur learned that these men were killed every day by a terrible lake monster called the Avank. Because the magical ointment would not work on him, the knights refused to let Peredur accompany them. He therefore set out alone to find the creature. On the road, he met an extraordinarily beautiful maiden seated upon a mound. She already knew where he was going and warned him that the Avank defeated its enemies through deception rather than strength. It hid inside a cave and watched anyone who approached while remaining unseen. From behind a stone pillar, it hurled poisoned spears at its victims. The maiden offered Peredur a magical stone that could make him invisible. In return, she demanded that he love her above all other women. Peredur immediately pledged his devotion, claiming that he had loved her from the moment he saw her. Before they separated, he asked where he might find her again. She answered that he must seek her in the direction of India. Armed with the stone and protected from the monster's sight, Peredur continued toward the Avank's hidden cave. Peredur's journey soon led him into a land unlike any he had ever seen. A broad valley stretched before him, where white sheep grazed on one side of a river and black sheep on the other. Whenever one animal cried out, a sheep would cross the water and instantly take on the color of the flock it had joined. Nearby stood a strange tree, one half consumed by fire, while the other remained covered in fresh green leaves. On a nearby mound sat a mysterious man with 2 greyhounds at his side, calmly watching the wilderness around him. When Peredur asked for directions, the stranger pointed him toward the cave of the fearsome Avank. Carrying the magical stone that concealed him from sight, Peredur entered the monster's lair unnoticed. With a swift attack, he slew the creature and carried its head back to 3 brothers who had long been forced to sacrifice themselves to the beast. They declared that an old prophecy had finally come true, and gratefully offered one of their sisters as his bride. Peredur respectfully declined, explaining that his quest was not yet over. Continuing his travels, Peredur was joined by a noble warrior named Edlim of the Red Sword, who pledged his loyalty. Together they reached the court of the Lady of Feats, whose hand could only be won by the knight capable of defeating all 300 of her champions. Peredur accomplished the impossible, yet when he discovered that the lady's heart truly belonged to Edlim, he gladly stepped aside and united the two in marriage instead. His path next led to the Mound of Mourning, where a mighty dragon guarded a magical stone said to bring limitless wealth. After defeating both the dragon and the ambitious rulers gathered to claim its treasure, Peredur refused to keep the reward for himself. Instead, he honored his allies, earned the loyalty of many kings, and presented the priceless stone to Edlim as a gift before continuing alone. Eventually, Peredur arrived at a magnificent tournament held by the Empress of Constantinople, who had vowed to marry only the greatest knight alive. Captivated by her beauty, he entered the competition and proved himself superior to every challenger. At first, he treated the Empress's messengers with cold indifference, but when they finally met face to face, she reminded him of a forgotten promise made long ago, back when she had given him the enchanted stone that had made his victory over the Avank possible. Her words awakened his memory, and Peredur realized that fate had been guiding his journey from the very beginning. This remarkable sequence closely mirrors another famous Welsh tale, the story of Owain. Like Peredur, Owain wanders through mysterious lands, receives guidance from supernatural figures, and confronts a dark knight whose defeat marks another triumph of courage over the unknown. Although the details differ, both legends follow the same timeless pattern. A hero passes through enchanted trials, overcomes monstrous enemies, and ultimately fulfills a destiny far greater than he first imagined. Trapped inside the castle with no apparent escape, Owain spotted a narrow crack in the wall that overlooked the street outside. Before long, a noblewoman dressed in flowing yellow satin approached the gate. A golden circlet rested upon her bright curls as she quietly called for the gate to be opened. When the guard explained that he was unable to do so, she pitied the imprisoned knight and praised the courage he had shown. Although she somehow already knew who he was, she revealed nothing of how she had learned it. Instead, she offered him a way out. Placing a ring into his hand, she explained that its enchanted stone could hide its wearer completely from sight whenever it was concealed within a closed fist. The soldiers would soon arrive to take him to his execution, but they would never see him. The woman, whose name was Lunette, instructed Owain to place his hand upon her shoulder once he became invisible so she could guide him safely through the castle. The plan worked perfectly. Hidden from every eye, Owain followed Lunette into a magnificent chamber high within the fortress. There she cared for him as an honored guest, bringing him food and drink, shaving his beard, and tending to his wounds. During the night, mournful cries echoed through the castle as news spread that the Black Knight had died. The following day, Owain watched the funeral procession from hiding and saw a grieving lady whose sorrow was unlike anything he had witnessed before. The moment he laid eyes on her, he confessed to Lunette that he had fallen deeply in love. Lunette gently reminded him that the woman he admired was the widow of the very knight he had slain. Winning her heart would be no easy task. Even so, she agreed to help. At first, her mistress rejected every suggestion with anger and grief, refusing to even consider another husband. But Lunette patiently pointed out a harsh reality. The Lady of the Fountain ruled lands that could only be defended by a warrior strong enough to defeat every challenger who came to the enchanted well. Without such a champion, her power would soon collapse. Pretending to travel to Arthur's court in search of such a knight, Lunette secretly prepared Owain for his return. She trimmed his beard, washed away every sign of his recent hardships, and presented him as though he had only just arrived from Camelot. The lady immediately recognized the deception, yet she could not ignore the simple truth. If Owain had defeated her former husband in fair combat, then he had already proven himself the strongest knight available. After consulting the leading nobles of her realm, she finally accepted him as her husband, and together they ruled peacefully for 3 years before Arthur and his companions eventually discovered where the missing knight had gone. The similarities between the adventures of Peredur and Owain are impossible to ignore. In both stories, generous hosts hesitate to reveal the path toward a deadly enemy, fearing that the hero will never return. Both knights then enter mysterious landscapes where strange guardians point them toward their destiny. Each faces a powerful supernatural opponent and survives only because of a magical object that grants invisibility at the decisive moment. The parallels continue beyond these encounters. Peredur earns the hand of a queen by proving himself unmatched in battle, while Owain secures the Lady of the Fountain through the very victory that made him her husband's conqueror. Both heroes ultimately become rulers beside powerful women whose realms depend upon extraordinary champions for their protection. There are, however, important differences. Owain owes much of his success to Lunette, whose intelligence, loyalty, and careful planning make his survival possible. Peredur has no such companion, and the woman destined to become his queen must pursue him herself. Owain's bride also represents a figure who moves from one heroic champion to another, linking darkness and light through successive marriages, whereas Peredur's empress arrives without such a past, leaving her earlier history shrouded in mystery. Another fascinating comparison appears in the hero's encounters with serpents. Peredur destroys a serpent guarding a golden ring before continuing his journey, while Owain rescues a white lion from a deadly serpent hidden among the rocks. In Owain's tale, the grateful lion becomes his constant companion, fighting beside him wherever danger appears. Medieval scholars later suggested that these seemingly different episodes may preserve the same ancient myth in different forms. The golden ring symbolizes the radiant sun, while the lion may represent the same divine force transformed through centuries of changing tradition. Beneath the surface of these Arthurian romances, older Celtic beliefs about light triumphing over darkness still quietly endure. During an Easter gathering at Arthur's court in Camelot, the celebration was interrupted by the arrival of a mysterious woman dressed entirely in black. Her appearance was unsettling, and unlike everyone else in the hall, she refused to greet Peredur. Instead, she publicly condemned him for a mistake that had changed countless lives. She reminded him of the time he had visited the court of the wounded king. There he had witnessed extraordinary wonders, including a bleeding spear carried through the hall, yet he had asked no questions. Had he shown curiosity, the king might have been healed, peace could have returned to the kingdom, and many future wars and tragedies would have been avoided. According to the Black Maiden, Peredur's silence had allowed suffering to continue. Before leaving, she spoke of two remarkable challenges. One was a mighty fortress filled with hundreds of renowned knights seeking worthy opponents. The other was even greater, a lonely castle under siege where a noble maiden desperately awaited a champion strong enough to break the siege. Her words inspired Arthur's knights to begin new quests. Gawain vowed to rescue the besieged lady, while Peredur swore that he would uncover the true meaning behind the Black Maiden's accusation. Soon afterward, a knight dressed in brilliant blue armor entered the court and accused Gawain of murdering his lord. Determined to clear his name, Gawain accepted the challenge, and he and Peredur began their journey together before eventually following separate paths. For nearly a year, Peredur wandered through lonely wilderness, avoiding towns and forgetting the passage of time itself. His aimless travels finally ended when he encountered a devout knight on Good Friday. Learning what day it was, Peredur realized how completely he had lost himself in his endless search. The holy knight welcomed him into a secluded castle where he remained for several days. Before they parted, the knight directed him toward the legendary Castle of Wonders, believing that the answers Peredur sought could only be found there. Following those directions, Peredur reached the kingdom of a hunting king. While the ruler rode into the forest, Peredur was escorted to the royal court, where the king's daughter welcomed him warmly. Her friendliness aroused suspicion, and the king ordered the stranger placed under guard. Despite his imprisonment, the princess treated Peredur with kindness and secretly allowed him to watch a great battle between her father's army and a rival earl. Disguised beneath a red cloak and carrying a bright yellow shield, Peredur entered the fighting without revealing his identity. For 3 consecutive days he became the decisive warrior on the battlefield, and on the 4th day he killed the rival earl, securing a complete victory for the king. Only afterward did the princess reveal the identity of the mysterious champion. Overwhelmed with gratitude, the king offered Peredur his daughter's hand in marriage along with the conquered lands. As he had done before, Peredur respectfully declined. His true goal was not a throne or a bride, but the Castle of Wonders. Recognizing that his ambition reached far beyond worldly rewards, the princess accepted his decision. She arranged guides, supplied everything he needed for the journey, and pointed him toward a distant lake where the mysterious castle was said to stand, wishing him success as he continued his quest. This episode mirrors several events from the story of Owain. Both heroes are drawn away from Arthur's court by mysterious women, endure long periods of isolation, receive guidance from unexpected allies, and are eventually placed back on the path toward their greater destiny. Although the details differ, both legends explore the same themes of forgotten duty, personal growth, and the difficult road to redemption. Following Lunette's instructions, Owain traveled to the castle of a respected nobleman whose generosity was known throughout the region. Yet despite the warm welcome, the entire household seemed consumed by sorrow. Before long, the reason became clear. A monstrous giant had captured the lord's 2 sons and demanded an unthinkable price. Unless the nobleman surrendered his only daughter, the brothers would be executed before their father's eyes at sunrise. Owain refused to stand aside. When the giant arrived the next morning, he and the loyal lion fought side by side against the enormous creature. After a fierce battle, the beast was finally defeated, and the nobleman's children were saved. With no desire for reward, Owain immediately resumed his own mission and hurried back to the place where Luned awaited her fate. He arrived only moments before her execution. Accused by jealous rivals and condemned without justice, Luned was about to be burned alive. Owain challenged those responsible, and with the lion fighting beside him once again, he overcame every opponent. Her enemies fell, and Luned was finally free. Grateful beyond words, she led Owain back to the Lady of the Fountain. Their reunion marked the end of a long separation, and the knight reclaimed both his honor and the life he had once abandoned. Peredur's path unfolded very differently. Rather than returning directly to the woman destined to become his wife, he still faced a series of difficult trials. Guided toward the legendary Castle of Wonders, he entered through its open gates and encountered a magical chessboard where the pieces moved without any human hand. Believing he could influence the game, he joined the contest. But every move he made only worsened the outcome. Frustrated, he hurled the board into the nearby lake. His outburst immediately drew the appearance of the mysterious Black Maiden. She rebuked him, explaining that the enchanted chessboard belonged to the Empress and was among her greatest treasures. If Peredur wished to repair the damage, he would first have to defeat a ruthless warrior who had been terrorizing part of the Empress's lands. Peredur accepted the challenge without hesitation. He defeated the outlaw in battle, but chose mercy instead of revenge, ordering the defeated man to restore the stolen chessboard. The Black Maiden, however, warned that evil left alive would only return. Realizing the danger, Peredur finished the task and ended the threat forever. Still, his trials were not complete. Next, he was sent into a nearby forest to hunt a magnificent stag with a single great antler. The hunt ended successfully, but another mysterious lady confronted him, accusing him of destroying one of the most remarkable creatures in her realm. Instead of condemning him completely, she pointed him toward yet another challenge, claiming that only by overcoming it could he continue his journey. Following her directions, Peredur climbed a lonely mountain until he reached an ancient stone. Calling for an opponent, he was answered by a grim warrior who emerged from beneath the earth, wearing weathered armor and riding a worn-out horse. Their duel was fierce, yet every apparent victory slipped away as the strange knight repeatedly escaped before Peredur could finish the fight. The mystery remained unsolved, forcing the young hero to continue onward. At last, he reached another castle, where an unexpected welcome awaited him. There he found Gawain, along with an aged and crippled lord who revealed himself to be Peredur's own uncle. It was here that many of the secrets surrounding his adventures were finally explained. A young man with golden hair stepped forward and confessed that he had been guiding Peredur from the beginning. He had appeared in many different disguises, including the terrifying Black Maiden, each time pushing the young knight toward the destiny that awaited him. He also revealed the truth behind the strange visions Peredur had witnessed long ago in the Hall of the Wounded King. The bleeding spear, the severed head, and the kingdom's suffering were all connected to an ancient crime committed by the witches of Gloucester who had murdered members of Peredur's family and crippled his uncle. The prophecy was now clear. Peredur had never been wandering without purpose. Every challenge had prepared him for one final duty: to destroy the witches and avenge his bloodline. Arthur and his knights gathered for the campaign, and a fierce battle followed. Even the witches' powerful magic could not stop the assault. Peredur personally struck down their leader, while Arthur's warriors swept through the battlefield until not a single witch remained alive. With their defeat, the long chain of vengeance was finally brought to an end, and Peredur's journey reached the destiny that had been waiting for him since the beginning. Peredur's greatest victory had not yet been won. Although he had defeated monsters, broken curses, and overcome every warrior placed before him, one final reward still remained beyond his reach. Whenever he asked to stand before the mysterious Empress, the answer was always the same: his journey was not yet complete. More trials awaited him, and only after proving himself worthy in every respect could he claim the future that destiny had promised. Unlike many heroes whose adventures end with a triumphant return, Peredur's path demanded constant sacrifice. Every challenge stripped away another layer of pride, forcing him to grow into something greater than a fearless warrior. Only after countless hardships would he be ready to reunite with the woman whose fate had long been intertwined with his own. The Empress herself remained one of the greatest mysteries in the entire legend. She was never presented as an ordinary queen or merely the wife of a powerful ruler. Instead, she stood above every earthly throne, a figure surrounded by ancient symbolism and supernatural authority. Earlier tales described her as the Empress of Great Constantinople, but that title seemed to carry a meaning beyond geography. It suggested that she belonged to an older world where myth and history blended together. Many storytellers later connected this remarkable woman with Elaine, one of the most celebrated female figures in Welsh tradition. Elaine was remembered as a ruler whose name became associated with imperial power and legendary kingdoms. Rather than serving as the companion of a mortal king, she represented sovereignty itself, choosing only the worthiest champion to stand beside her. Peredur never sought crowns, castles, or vast estates. Again and again he rejected offers of land and marriage that would have satisfied almost any knight. His ambition was different. He pursued wisdom, honor, and the completion of the quest placed before him. Because of that unwavering determination, the Empress eventually chose him. Not for his noble birth or wealth, but because his courage surpassed that of every rival. The tale also echoes much older Celtic beliefs. Ancient traditions often paired a heroic warrior with a powerful queen whose favor symbolized the right to rule. The Empress appears to preserve that ancient idea, standing as the embodiment of destiny itself. By winning her trust, Peredur does more than gain a bride. He earns the approval of the supernatural forces guiding his entire journey. This theme becomes even clearer when the Welsh legend is compared with Irish mythology. There, the warrior Ciw Chulin encounters the mysterious goddess Morrigan, a figure both protective and dangerous. She first offers him her help because of his unmatched reputation in battle. When he rejects her, she repeatedly tests him, appearing in different forms and placing obstacles in his path. Only much later does she attempt to protect him from the fate she knows cannot be avoided. Peredur experiences a remarkably similar pattern. After becoming separated from the Empress, he is repeatedly challenged through the actions of the Black Maiden. Every hardship serves a purpose. Rather than punishing him out of hatred, these trials prepare him for the responsibility waiting at the end of his quest. The hero gradually learns that true greatness is measured not by victories alone, but by endurance, wisdom, and loyalty. The comparison extends beyond their relationships. Both Peredur and Ciw Chulin undergo demanding training before reaching their full potential. Ciw Chulin leaves his homeland to study under legendary masters, overcoming impossible dangers before completing his education. Peredur follows a different road, yet his progress is marked by similar tests. Elder warriors challenge his skill, mysterious mentors push him beyond his limits, and every success reveals another lesson still left to learn. Even the enemies surrounding the heroes share common themes. Shape-shifting figures, powerful sorcerers, and deceptive guides appear throughout both traditions. They rarely confront the hero directly. Instead, they manipulate events from the shadows, forcing the young warrior to mature through hardship rather than simple combat. Every victory prepares him for an even greater challenge lying further ahead. As the legend reaches its final stages, Peredur understands that every strange encounter, from the Black Maiden's harsh words to the Empress's distant silence, has been leading him toward a single purpose. His journey is no longer about defeating monsters or earning glory. It has become a search for identity, justice, and the fulfillment of an ancient destiny that was waiting long before he ever picked up a sword. As Peredur's story drew closer to its conclusion, it became clear that one final chapter was missing. His victories had earned him fame across distant kingdoms, yet the reward promised since the beginning of his quest remained just beyond his reach. Every trial had led him toward the mysterious Empress, but fate repeatedly delayed their reunion. It was as though destiny demanded that he become more than a champion before he could stand at her side. Unlike many rulers in Arthurian tradition, the Empress was portrayed as a figure whose authority reached beyond any earthly kingdom. She was not simply a queen waiting to be rescued. Instead, she represented an ancient and almost sacred form of sovereignty, choosing only the knight who had proven himself through courage, sacrifice, and unwavering determination. Her connection to the legendary city of Constantinople only strengthened her aura of mystery, placing her halfway between history and myth. Some storytellers associated this powerful woman with the legendary Elen, a heroine remembered throughout Welsh tradition. Elen symbolized rightful rule, divine favor, and the prosperity of kingdoms. Whether the Empress truly represented Elen or merely inherited some of her qualities, both figures embodied the same timeless idea that true authority belongs to those chosen by destiny rather than by birth alone. Peredur himself never chased power for its own sake. Again and again he refused lands, titles, and noble marriages offered as rewards for his victories. His attention remained fixed on completing the task before him, no matter how difficult the road became. It was this refusal to seek personal gain that ultimately distinguished him from countless other knights. The legend also echoes stories found across the Celtic world. Irish tradition tells of heroes whose paths are shaped by mysterious women capable of helping, testing, or misleading them. These figures rarely act out of simple kindness or cruelty. Instead, they force warriors to confront their own weaknesses until they are worthy of fulfilling a greater purpose. The Empress and the Black Maiden appear to serve exactly this role in Peredur's journey. The same pattern can be seen in the life of Cuchulainn. Before becoming Ireland's greatest champion, he was driven far from home to master the arts of war under legendary teachers. His education demanded endurance as much as skill, and every hardship transformed him into a stronger warrior. Peredur follows a similar path. Each challenge prepares him for another, reminding him that mastery is earned through perseverance rather than natural talent. Both heroes also face enemies who rely on deception instead of brute force. Sorcerers, shapeshifters, and hidden manipulators guide events from the shadows, forcing the young champions to rely on judgment instead of strength alone. Their greatest victories come not from defeating monsters, but from learning to recognize truth hidden beneath illusion. As Peredur's adventures continue, he begins to realize that even those who seemed to oppose him were helping shape his destiny. The mysterious Black Maiden, the strange guardians he encountered, and the cryptic warnings scattered throughout his travels all served the same purpose. They pushed him toward the final stage of his transformation. By the end of the legend, Peredur is no longer simply an adventurous knight seeking glory. He has become a figure who unites courage with wisdom, proving that the greatest quests are not won by the sword alone. Every battle, every setback, and every mystery has prepared him for a destiny far greater than he could have imagined when he first rode away from home. As Peredur's legend spread across Britain, later storytellers began reshaping parts of his adventure to fit new audiences and new traditions. Every generation added its own ideas, blending ancient Celtic beliefs with the growing world of Arthurian romance. Because of this, the story survives in several different forms, each preserving fragments of an older myth while introducing entirely new interpretations. One of the greatest mysteries concerns the Fisher King and Peredur's relationship with him. In some traditions, the wounded ruler appears as a wise relative deserving the young knight's loyalty. In others, hints remain that the two may once have stood on opposite sides of a far older conflict. Rather than acting as a simple mentor, the Fisher King may originally have represented an ancient supernatural power whose age was coming to an end as a new champion rose to take his place. This idea helps explain why Peredur's journey is filled with uneasy encounters instead of straightforward alliances. Characters who appear friendly often conceal secrets, while apparent enemies occasionally become unexpected guides. The boundaries between ally and rival are constantly shifting, giving the legend a dreamlike quality that sets it apart from ordinary medieval adventure stories. Later versions of the tale introduced new villains, enchanted castles, and mysterious warriors to fill the gaps left by older traditions. One recurring figure is a ruthless spear-wielding killer who attacks unseen before disappearing into the shadows. Heroes pursuing him discover that defeating a single enemy is never enough, because every victory reveals an even deeper mystery hidden behind the conflict. Other storytellers connected Peridure's adventures with the growing legends of the Holy Grail. Familiar locations were transformed into sacred places, ancient magical objects became holy relics, and older Celtic kings were gradually reimagined as guardians of Christian mysteries. Although the setting changed, many of the underlying themes remained the same. The hero still had to prove his courage, wisdom, and compassion before reaching the final stage of his quest. Scholars have also noticed striking similarities between Peredur and heroes from Irish tradition. Like Cuchulainn, Peredur spends years developing his abilities under demanding teachers before confronting enemies tied to his own family's past. Neither hero receives greatness as a gift. Every achievement is earned through relentless trials that test both strength and character. Magic plays a different role in these legends than it does in many later fantasy stories. Sorcery is rarely used simply to destroy an opponent. Instead, it creates uncertainty, forcing heroes to question everything they see. Shape-shifting strangers, enchanted landscapes, and impossible challenges all serve one purpose: to reveal whether the warrior possesses wisdom as well as courage. Perhaps the most fascinating figure remains the Black Maiden. At first, she seems cruel, criticizing Peredur at every opportunity and driving him toward dangerous adventures. Yet, as the story unfolds, her actions begin to appear deliberate rather than malicious. Every challenge she sets before him pushes him one step closer to becoming the hero he was destined to become. Without her relentless demands, Peredur might never have fulfilled his true purpose. As Arthurian legends spread across medieval Europe, every storyteller reshaped familiar heroes to suit a new audience. Characters changed names, kingdoms shifted locations, and old Celtic myths slowly merged with the ideals of medieval chivalry. Among the figures transformed most dramatically was Lancelot, whose earliest adventures reveal a hero very different from the knight celebrated in later romances. According to one early tradition, Lancelot's life began in tragedy. His father's kingdom collapsed under rebellion, forcing the royal family to flee. The king died before escaping, while the infant prince was carried away by a mysterious lady of the lake. Hidden within her enchanted realm, beyond the reach of ordinary men, the child was raised in secret until the day he would be ready to face the outside world. The lady did not rescue the young prince out of kindness alone. She believed he was destined to defeat a terrible tyrant whose power had spread fear across neighboring lands. From childhood, Lancelot was prepared for that purpose. When he reached adulthood, he left the magical island and entered a world filled with rival kingdoms, wandering knights, and impossible challenges. His early adventures tested every quality expected of a legendary champion. He overcame powerful enemies, survived imprisonment, and defeated beasts that ordinary warriors would never dare confront. Each victory earned him greater fame, yet none of them marked the true beginning of his destiny. Like many heroes of Celtic tradition, every completed task merely opened the door to an even greater trial. One of the defining moments of his career came when he confronted a mighty lord who could only be challenged through an ancient ritual performed beside a sacred well. Such enchanted locations appear throughout Celtic mythology, where springs, lakes, and forests often serve as gateways between the human world and the realm of supernatural beings. By overcoming the guardian of this mysterious place, Lancelot secured not only victory, but also a kingdom and a royal bride. As later generations retold the legend, many scholars noticed striking similarities between Lancelot's adventures and those of Peredur. Both heroes spend their youth separated from ordinary society before emerging as extraordinary warriors. Both are guided by mysterious women connected with magical lakes or hidden realms. Both wander through a landscape where every challenge seems carefully arranged to shape their character rather than simply test their strength. These similarities suggest that the two heroes may preserve different versions of an older tradition. Over centuries, the stories gradually drifted apart. Peredur remained closely connected to Welsh mythology, while Lancelot became increasingly associated with the ideals of French courtly romance. Yet beneath those differences, the foundations of their journeys still look remarkably alike. One of the greatest changes concerns Lancelot's famous devotion to Queen Guinevere. In the earliest forms of his legend, this relationship is far less important than it would later become. His adventures revolve primarily around proving his worth through courage, endurance, and loyalty. Only in later romances does his love for the queen become the central theme that defines his character. Many historians believe this transformation reflects the changing tastes of medieval audiences. Earlier, Celtic heroes sought honor through dangerous quests and supernatural encounters. Later writers preferred stories of forbidden love, inner conflict, and personal sacrifice. As a result, Lancelot gradually evolved from a mythic warrior into the perfect image of the tragic courtly knight. Even after these changes, older traditions continued to survive beneath the surface. Enchanted castles, mysterious ladies, magical bridges, hidden kingdoms, and seemingly endless trials all remained essential parts of Lancelot's adventures. These elements reveal that his story never completely abandoned its Celtic roots, even after centuries of adaptation by French and German poets. During Lancelot's pursuit of the abducted queen, he reached a lonely castle where a young woman offered him shelter under a strange condition. He would have to share her bed. Though uncomfortable with the request, Lancelot accepted because he urgently needed rest and guidance. Before nightfall, a powerful knight attacked the woman. Lancelot immediately intervened and defeated him after a brutal struggle. Later, when he entered the promised chamber, he kept his distance and refused to take advantage of his hostess. Realizing that he was driven by a dangerous and honorable mission, the woman quietly left him alone and wished him success. The next morning, she asked Lancelot to escort her. Since her route also led toward the lands of Badamagu, he agreed. Along the way, they encountered another knight who challenged him, but the young man's father prevented the fight. Suspecting that Lancelot was no ordinary warrior, the father secretly followed him to a monastery filled with tombs prepared for the greatest living knights. At the center stood an enormous stone grave. Its lid was so heavy that several strong men could not have lifted it, yet Lancelot raised it without difficulty. Beneath it was an inscription declaring that the man capable of opening the tomb would one day free the prisoners of Goira. The test confirmed that Lancelot was the champion foretold by prophecy. This scene resembles an important moment in the legend of Peredur. Instead of lifting a tombstone, Peredur is asked to repair a broken sword. His success proves both his identity and the extraordinary level of skill he has already achieved. In both stories, a physical test reveals that the hero has been chosen for a greater destiny. The most famous symbol in Lancelot's adventure, however, is the cart. After losing his horse, he accepts a place in a dwarf's vehicle. In that world, carts were associated with criminals and public disgrace, so people mock him wherever he goes. His willingness to endure humiliation shows that rescuing the queen matters more to him than his reputation. Yet the queen later criticizes him because he hesitated for a single moment before entering it. This detail transforms the cart into a test of absolute devotion. Lancelot is not judged for accepting shame, but for briefly allowing pride to stand between him and his purpose. The episode may preserve traces of an older myth. In Celtic stories, heroes sometimes receive rolling objects, a wheel, a ring, or even a magical apple that guide them across dangerous landscapes. Such objects may once have symbolized the movement of the sun through the sky. Over time, that ancient image may have been transformed into the humiliating but unforgettable cart of medieval romance. The French poet Chrétien de Troyes also changed the emotional character of the tale. In older Welsh stories, heroes are usually described through their actions. Their fears, doubts, and passions are rarely explored in detail. Chrétien, by contrast, places emotion at the center of the story. This difference reveals how Arthurian legend changed as it moved from Wales into the courts of France. The older tales focused on mysterious events, sacred landscapes, and heroic deeds. The later romances entered the minds of their characters, transforming ancient myth into deeply personal drama. Lancelot's connection with Elaine begins during one of his many journeys in search of adventure. After crossing the mysterious bridge of Corbenic, he reached a prosperous city that had long suffered from dangers and unrest. Through his courage and skill, he freed the land from its troubles, earning the gratitude of its ruler, King Pelles, the lord of the distant kingdom. Pelles welcomed the famous knight with every honor, yet his generosity concealed a carefully planned purpose. The king believed an ancient prophecy that declared a child born from Lancelot and his daughter Elaine would one day become the greatest knight the world had ever seen. That child would be Galahad, the hero destined to accomplish what no other knight could achieve, the ultimate quest for the Holy Grail and the salvation of the land. Knowing that Lancelot's heart belonged entirely to Queen Guinevere, Pelles realized the prophecy could never come true through ordinary means. To overcome this obstacle, he relied on Dame Brisen, a woman gifted in enchantment and illusion. She devised a clever deception that would convince Lancelot he was meeting Guinevere instead of Elaine. The first step involved sending a trusted messenger carrying a ring identical to one the queen often wore. The sight of the familiar jewel erased every doubt from Lancelot's mind. Believing Guinevere was waiting for him nearby, he eagerly rode toward the castle of Case without suspecting that every part of the journey had been carefully arranged. Before Lancelot arrived, Elaine had already been escorted to the castle under heavy guard. Everything was prepared for the meeting. When the knight entered the castle, Dame Bryson welcomed him with a cup of wine that carried a powerful enchantment. As soon as he drank it, his senses became clouded. Unable to recognize the illusion surrounding him, he entered Elaine's chamber convinced that she was the queen he loved. That single night fulfilled King Pelles' hopes. Elaine knew the prophecy well and believed that the child conceived there would become the greatest champion in Arthurian history. From this union, Galahad was born, a knight whose purity and virtue would eventually surpass even the legendary Lancelot himself. The expectation surrounding his birth resembles several older Celtic traditions in which extraordinary heroes enter the world through events guided by fate rather than chance. The deception, however, did not remain hidden forever. Some time after Galahad's birth, Elaine appeared at King Arthur's court during a grand celebration. Dame Bryson once again used her magical talents to bring Lancelot and Elaine together. This second encounter had disastrous consequences. Queen Guinevere became overwhelmed by jealousy after discovering Elaine's presence and drove her away from court. Lancelot, torn between love, guilt, and confusion, eventually lost his sanity. For years, the greatest knight of the Round Table wandered Britain without reason or purpose. His once unmatched brilliance disappeared beneath madness, and many believed he would never recover. Fate eventually carried him back to Corbenic, where Elaine and Dame Bryson immediately recognized him. Rather than abandoning him, they carefully restrained him and brought him before the Holy Grail. Its sacred power restored his mind completely, returning him to the noble warrior he had once been. After recovering, Lancelot asked King Pelles to provide a peaceful home where he and Elaine could live together. The king granted them the castle of Blyant, located on the Joyous Isle, a place protected by deep waters and powerful iron defenses. There Lancelot chose to hide his identity, calling himself the Knight Malfet instead of using the famous name known throughout Arthur's kingdom. His disguise proved so convincing that even relatives of King Pelles failed to recognize him. When one nephew accidentally addressed him by his true name, he immediately realized his mistake and begged forgiveness, showing the immense respect inspired by the legendary knight. Lancelot remained on the Joyous Isle with Elaine until a group of Arthur's knights eventually discovered him. Recognizing their old companion despite his disguise, they persuaded him to return once more to Camelot. His arrival filled the court with celebration, for many had believed the greatest knight of the Round Table was lost forever. These episodes closely parallel several important Welsh romances. Lancelot's stay with Elaine strongly echoes Peredur's time with the Empress after her tournament to choose a husband, while it also resembles Owain's marriage to the Lady of the Fountain following the death of her first husband. Dame Bryson fulfills a role similar to the mysterious Black Maiden in the story of Peredur, as well as the magical female guide who appears in Owain's tale. Each woman ultimately guides a wandering hero back toward his forgotten duties and rightful destiny. The similarities continue beyond the characters themselves. King Pelles closely resembles the Welsh figure Pelur, who appears as Elaine's father in another version of the Grail legend. Even the geography reflects the shared tradition. The castle of Case lies only a few miles from King Pelles' stronghold, just as important castles stand unusually close together in the Welsh romances. Such repeated patterns suggest that these stories grew from a common narrative tradition before evolving into separate versions. Yet Malory introduces another woman named Elaine, creating one of the most memorable romances connected with Lancelot. She is known as the Fair Maid of Astolat. Although presented as a different character, many scholars believe she represents another version of the earlier Elaine, adapted from a separate storytelling tradition. While traveling to a tournament near Camelot, Lancelot accepted hospitality from a nobleman named Bernard. Bernard had 2 sons and a daughter named Elaine. One son, Lavaine, admired Lancelot's honor so deeply that he asked to become his companion. Elaine, however, quickly fell in love with the famous knight. Hoping to inspire him, she persuaded Lancelot to wear one of her scarlet sleeves, beautifully embroidered with pearls, on his helmet during the tournament. It was an extraordinary request, because Lancelot had never before carried a lady's favor in combat. The tournament proved brutal. During the fighting, Lancelot was gravely wounded by his own relative, Sir Bors, who failed to recognize him beneath his disguise. When Bors eventually learned whom he had struck, he was filled with regret. Elaine's sorrow, however, ran even deeper. Determined to save the man she loved, she searched tirelessly until she found him. She devoted herself completely to his recovery, caring for him with remarkable patience until he was once again strong enough to ride. Despite her devotion, Lancelot never returned her love. Once his strength had returned, he continued his journey, leaving Elaine behind. She confessed that life without him held no meaning and declared she could never belong to another man. Her love slowly consumed her. Within only a few days of his departure, she fell gravely ill, weakened by heartbreak rather than disease. Before her death, Elaine dictated a final message for Lancelot. She described herself as the Maiden of Astolat, confessed that she had loved him with complete devotion, and asked only for prayers, a proper burial, and a simple offering for her soul. She died without ever marrying, remaining faithful to the knight who could never return her affection. According to her final wishes, her body was placed inside a richly decorated barge covered with magnificent cloth of gold. The letter rested in her hand as the silent vessel drifted along the river toward Camelot. When it reached Westminster, King Arthur and his court came aboard to discover the identity of the mysterious young woman. After reading her farewell message, they gave her an honorable burial. Lancelot himself attended the ceremony and fulfilled her final request, mourning her deeply despite never having been her lover. The story of the Fair Maid of Astolat would later inspire one of the greatest poems in English literature. The name Astolat gradually evolved into Shalott, and from it, Alfred, Lord Tennyson, created the unforgettable Lady of Shalott. In his vision, the lady lives alone upon a magical island, endlessly weaving while watching the outside world only through the reflection of a mirror. Forbidden by an unknown curse to look directly toward Camelot, she spends her days observing passing travelers, knights, and ordinary people through enchanted reflections. Everything changes when Sir Lancelot rides past her island. His brilliant armor flashes beneath the sunlight, and his appearance overwhelms the lonely lady. Unable to resist any longer, she abandons her loom and gazes directly toward Camelot. At that instant, the mirror shatters, her woven tapestry flies apart, and she realizes the ancient curse has finally taken hold. Knowing death is inevitable, she enters a small boat, writes her name upon its prow, and allows the current to carry her toward Camelot. As the river bears her through the fading evening, she sings one final song before her voice falls silent forever. By the time the boat reaches the city, she is already dead. Arthur's court gathers along the riverbank, wondering who this mysterious woman might be. Even the celebration inside the palace comes to an end as everyone stares in silence. Lancelot steps forward to look upon her face. After a brief moment of reflection, he quietly offers a final blessing, praying that God may show mercy to her soul. It is a simple ending, yet one filled with sadness, completing one of the most enduring and tragic love stories found anywhere in the Arthurian legends. Beyond the 2 women named Elaine, already connected with Lancelot, Malory introduces yet another figure bearing almost the same name. This third woman, called Elaine, appears only briefly, but her story hints at a much older legend hidden beneath the surface. She is presented as the daughter of King Pellinore, who is also the father of Percival. Although her role is small, her tragic fate suggests that she belongs to the same mythological tradition as the other Elaines. Malory tells us only the essentials. Elaine falls into despair after the death of the knight she was meant to marry, Sir Miles of the Landes. Unable to bear her grief, she ends her own life. The man responsible for killing her future husband is a warrior named Lorraine le Savage. The account is so brief that it leaves many questions unanswered, making it difficult to understand the deeper symbolic roles of either the slain knight or his killer. Yet the few details that survive point toward a much older narrative whose original meaning has largely been lost. Far more intriguing than Elaine herself is her father, King Pellinore. He is one of the strangest figures in the Arthurian world. Rather than ruling peacefully from a court, Pellinore spends nearly his entire life pursuing a mysterious creature. His endless hunt becomes such an obsession that he neglects everything else, even failing to prevent the tragedy that destroys his own daughter. According to the legend, his quest belongs exclusively to him and to those of his own bloodline, making it less a personal adventure than an inherited destiny. Whenever anyone wished to find Pellinore, they were told to search near a certain enchanted spring. There he endlessly pursued the bizarre creature known as the questing beast, sometimes called the barking beast. King Arthur himself encounters this extraordinary animal before ever meeting Pellinore. The sight leaves a lasting impression. The beast appears unlike anything Arthur has ever seen. It approaches the spring and begins to drink peacefully. While it remains at the water, complete silence fills the air. Yet moments earlier, and again as soon as it departs, a deafening sound echoes from inside its own body. The noise resembles the cries of dozens of hunting hounds pursuing prey across the countryside. Rather than coming from outside, the barking seems trapped within the creature itself, creating one of the most haunting images in Arthurian literature. That mysterious spring serves as Pellinore's favorite meeting place. After taking Arthur's horse during one of their early encounters, the king calmly tells Arthur exactly where he can find him again if he wishes to challenge him. The image recalls another famous Arthurian figure, the Black Knight of the Fountain, who also waits beside a magical well for worthy opponents. Like that mysterious guardian, Pellinore collects the horses of defeated knights, adding another parallel between the two legends. Unlike many Arthurian heroes, however, Pellinore never completes the mission that defines his life. Even after his death, the hunt does not end. Responsibility passes to one of his closest relatives, Sir Palamedes, the Black Shield. Although famous for his courage, Palamedes remains an outsider within Arthur's kingdom. He is a Saracen knight, frequently viewed with suspicion, and throughout the legends he becomes both rival and enemy to Sir Tristan, one of the greatest champions of Camelot. The strange hunt itself remains unexplained. Pellinore swears before Arthur's court that he will always tell the truth about his quest, yet neither he nor anyone else ever reveals the true nature of the beast. Medieval storytellers simply accept its existence without offering a clear interpretation. That silence has encouraged generations of scholars to search for meanings hidden beneath the romance. Many believe the creature belongs not to ordinary folklore, but to a much older mythological tradition. Its endless barking recalls the terrifying watchdogs of the underworld found in many ancient cultures. Instead of being a simple wild animal, the questing beast may once have been imagined as a supernatural guardian associated with darkness, death, or the world beyond human life. The repeated image of countless hounds crying out from within a single body strengthens this impression, suggesting a creature connected with forces beyond the natural world. Some researchers have even proposed that the original legend described not a beast hunted by Pellinore, but an enormous supernatural hound that accompanied him. The familiar image of the questing beast may therefore preserve the memory of an older guardian animal whose appearance gradually changed as stories evolved over centuries. This interpretation becomes even more convincing when the legend is compared with Welsh mythology. There, Pellinore closely resembles Gwyn ap Nudd, the mysterious ruler of the Otherworld. Gwyn is famous for leading the spectral wild hunt across the night sky, accompanied by terrifying supernatural hounds whose cries foretell approaching death. In later Christian tradition, these ghostly hunters no longer pursue every human soul. Instead, they are said to chase only the spirits of the wicked, reflecting the influence of medieval religious beliefs upon much older pagan legends. Welsh tradition preserves vivid descriptions of these otherworldly dogs. They race through the darkness, their voices echoing across the hills before suddenly falling silent whenever they catch their unseen prey. Witnesses claimed that moments later, terrible screams could be heard, as though another soul had been carried away into the world beyond. Such stories remained part of Welsh folklore for centuries and survived long after belief in the old gods had faded. Among these spectral hounds, one stands above all the others. Ancient Welsh poetry remembers an enormous dog named Dormarth, described as the greatest and most fearsome of Gwyn's hunting pack. Although later scribes struggled to understand the meaning of its unusual name, many scholars believe it originally referred to a supernatural guardian standing at the entrance to the realm of the dead. The name itself may preserve a forgotten piece of Celtic mythology. Some interpretations connect it with the concept of death acting as the gateway to the other world. Rather than simply representing a hunting dog, Dormarth may have symbolized the terrifying passage between life and the afterlife. Medieval artists often imagined the entrance to hell as the open jaws of a monstrous beast, while similar expressions survive in later European languages through phrases such as the jaws of death. These striking similarities suggest that ancient storytellers may have pictured death not merely as an event, but as a monstrous mouth waiting to swallow the living. Welsh folklore strengthens this connection. Stories describe the supernatural hounds racing low across the night sky, led by a gigantic dog far larger and louder than the rest. As they pursue invisible prey, their barking suddenly ceases, followed by chilling cries that echo through the darkness. The silence is said to mark the moment when another victim has been claimed. Such images blur the boundary between hunting and death, turning the wild hunt into a terrifying symbol of mortality itself. Viewed from this perspective, Pelinor's endless pursuit begins to resemble far more than a knightly adventure. His quest may preserve fragments of an ancient myth concerning the forces of death and the mysterious boundary separating the living world from the realm beyond. Even after the stories were reshaped into Arthurian romance, traces of that older tradition remained embedded within the legend. Returning to the women named Elaine, their stories reveal striking similarities despite their different destinies. Elaine, daughter of King Pelles, lives happily beside Lancelot for many years on the Joyous Isle, much as Peredur remains with the Empress in Welsh tradition. The fair maid of Astolat, however, experiences no such happiness. Although she loves Lancelot with complete devotion, he never returns her feelings, and she dies with her love unfulfilled. Elaine, daughter of Pellinor, suffers an equally tragic fate, losing the man she was destined to marry before their wedding could ever take place. Yet all three women share one remarkable characteristic. Instead of waiting passively to be courted, they openly express their own feelings and actively pursue the men they love. For medieval romance, this is an unusually bold pattern. Rather than reflecting the imagination of later writers, it may preserve an even older storytelling tradition inherited from Celtic mythology. A similar scene appears in the Irish epic Táin Bo Cuailnge, where the powerful goddess Morrigan boldly offers her love to the hero Cu Chulainn. The resemblance suggests that these Arthurian heroines may carry echoes of ancient supernatural women whose confidence and independence survived long after their original myths had been transformed into medieval romance. The Elaine who shared Lancelot's life on the Joyous Isle is usually remembered as the mother of Galahad, but the question of Galahad's true ancestry is far more complicated than it first appears. Medieval romances, Welsh tradition, and older Celtic mythology do not always tell the same story. When these different versions are compared, Galahad's family line becomes part of a much larger pattern in which heroes, gods, and legendary rulers gradually exchange identities. A Welsh triad offers one of the clearest examples of this confusion. It names three knights of Arthur's court who succeeded in finding the Holy Grail: Galahad, son of Lancelot du Lac; Peredur, son of Earl Evroch, and Bort, son of King Bort. The first two are described as physically pure, while the third is said to have committed only one act of sexual sin. According to the tradition, this happened when he was tempted by the daughter of Brangor, the Empress of Constantinople, and from their union came a powerful and celebrated line. The triad then claims that all three Grail Knights descended from Joseph of Arimathea and ultimately from the house of the biblical King David. The Empress of Constantinople is clearly related to the woman who becomes Peredur's wife in the Welsh romance. She also seems to preserve features of Ellen, one of the most important women in Welsh legendary tradition. Her father's name, Brangor, appears to be a Welsh attempt to reproduce the name Brandegor found in Malory. Yet Brandegor itself may have originally been understood as Bran of Gower. Gower is the peninsula extending into the Severn Sea, while Bran is one of the great names associated with the Celtic ruler of the Otherworld. This connection becomes especially important in Malory's account of Sir Bors. At the court of King Brandegor, Bors encounters a 15-year-old boy named Helen LeBlanc. The young knight is openly recognized as Bors' son, born from Brandegor's daughter many years earlier. Bors is delighted by the boy and decides immediately to take him to Arthur's court. Brandegor agrees, although he worries that Helen is still too young. The departure causes great sorrow within the household, but Bors insists that his son must be brought to the most honorable court in the world. When they reach Camelot, Arthur learns that Helen is the son of Bors and the grandson of Brandegor. The boy is then admitted among the Knights of the Round Table and proves himself both courageous and eager for adventure. On the surface, the episode seems to be only another story of a young knight beginning his career. Yet, when placed beside the Welsh triad, it raises a much deeper question. Was Helen originally another form of Galahad? The Sir Bors of Malory is almost certainly the same figure called Bort in the Welsh text. Their names are too similar to ignore, and both belong to the small group of knights who successfully reach the Holy Grail. Malory also gives Bors an ancestry that links him closely with Lancelot. He is the brother of King Ban of Benwick, Lancelot's father, and ruler of the land of Gauns. Both kingdoms lie overseas and suffer attacks from King Claudas. Ban and Bors are eventually called to Britain by Arthur, who needs their aid. The figure of King Ban may itself preserve an older form of Uther Pendragon. The similarity is not limited to their names. Ban dies immediately after drinking from a spring, while in Geoffrey of Monmouth's history, Uther dies after his enemies poison the well from which he regularly drinks. Such parallels suggest that Ban and Uther were once related figures before the traditions divided them into separate characters. Once Ban is connected with Uther, Bors can be compared with Ambrosius, also known in Welsh as Emrys. Geoffrey presents Ambrosius and Uther as brothers living in exile in France before they return to Britain to challenge Vortigern. But the name Ambrosius itself combines two very different traditions. One belongs to the historical military leader Aurelius Ambrosius. The other belongs to Merlin Ambrosius, a supernatural figure who may preserve a Celtic form of the supreme sky god. This interpretation transforms the story of Bors and Brandegor's daughter. Bors is no longer merely one of Lancelot's relatives. He becomes a surviving form of Ambrosius or Merlin, while the woman he loves can be linked with Ellen, the legendary empress. Their union may therefore preserve an older myth in which a divine ruler and a powerful otherworld woman produce an exceptional son. This may explain why different romances assign the same role to different men. In one version, Elaine becomes the mother of Galahad by Lancelot. In another, Brandegor's daughter bears Helen to Bors. In the Welsh Peredur story, the Empress becomes the companion of Peredur. These may not be entirely separate traditions. They may instead be later rearrangements of one much older myth whose characters changed identities as it passed from one language and region to another. Malory's own narrative contains a striking clue. Helen LeBlanc is 15 years old when Bors takes him to Camelot for knighthood. In the same general section of the story, Arthur's knights discover Lancelot living with Elaine on the Joyous Isle and persuade him to return to court. Elaine is deeply distressed because their son Galahad is also approaching knighthood at Pentecost. and he too is 15. The matching ages are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Helen and Galahad appear at almost exactly the same stage of life and are associated with fathers who both belong to the Grail tradition. This strongly suggests that the two young men may represent different versions of the same original hero. One tradition made him the son of Bors, while another assigned him to Lancelot. The confusion may have arisen because two different women were eventually merged under the single name Elaine. One was a gentle lake-associated lady who became the hero's companion and the mother of his child. The other was a more forceful and dangerous woman whose love was rejected. When the two characters were blended together, the stories surrounding their lovers and sons also became mixed. Welsh tradition gives Galahad's mother another name, Gwaihir. This is especially significant because Gwaihir may be compared with the Morrigan of Irish mythology. The Morrigan is not a passive romantic heroine. She is a powerful supernatural woman connected with battle, prophecy, sovereignty, and death. In the Irish epic of Cú Chulainn, she openly approaches the hero and offers herself to him, but he rejects her. Her response is not gentle sorrow, but anger and retaliation. This pattern may preserve the older character behind the woman whose love Lancelot refuses. She should perhaps never have been called Elaine at all. The true Elaine may have been the gracious Lady of the Lake type who lives with Lancelot on the Joyous Isle and becomes the mother of his son. The rejected woman may originally have belonged to a darker and more formidable tradition, closer to the Morrigan than to the sorrowful fair maid of Astolat. The Elaine of the Joyous Isle and the Lady of Shalott can therefore be viewed as different expressions of the same water-associated female figure. Both are linked with isolation, beauty, longing, and the mysterious world beyond ordinary society. They resemble figures such as Fand in the Irish story of Cú Chulainn, a supernatural woman connected with an island realm and an impossible love. By contrast, the woman who confronts the hero and is rejected belongs to another mythological type altogether. Her emotions are active, demanding, and potentially destructive. She is not merely waiting to be loved. She chooses, approaches, challenges, and reacts. Such a figure fits the ancient Celtic goddess far better than the delicate heroines created by later courtly romance. The same merging of characters can be seen in other Arthurian stories. Peredur's empress may once have been separate from the mysterious maiden who gives him the Stone of Concealment. In the surviving romance, the two roles appear close enough to be treated as parts of one narrative, yet an earlier version may have kept them distinct. Peredur may even have continued rejecting the empress, just as Cú Chulainn rejects the Morrigan, rather than eventually accepting her as his wife. A similar transformation seems to have affected the story of Owain and the Lady of the Fountain. The supernatural helper, the wife, the ruler of the enchanted territory, and the offended woman may originally have belonged to different roles. Medieval storytellers often combined them to create smoother and more emotionally satisfying romances. The result was a clearer story, but one that concealed the structure of the older mythology. This confusion may have begun very early. Celtic myths were constantly reshaped as older divine figures were replaced by newer heroic characters. A god could become a king could become a knight, and a divine marriage could be rewritten as a courtly romance. In some traditions, the ancient ruler of the gods was displaced by a solar hero or culture hero, while his wife and children were transferred to the newer figure. Galahad's two main pedigrees reflect this process. In the familiar Arthurian version, he is the son of Lancelot and Elaine. Mythologically, this makes him the child of a heroic, possibly solar father, and a woman associated with lakes, islands, and the otherworld. In the alternative tradition, he is descended from Bors or Ambrosius, and a woman linked with Ellen or Gwaihir. This makes him the son of a Celtic sky god and his supernatural consort. Neither genealogy is necessarily more valid than the other. Both express the same idea in different mythological languages. Galahad is born from an extraordinary union and belongs partly to the human world and partly to the Divine One. His ability to complete the Grail quest depends not simply on his moral purity, but on the supernatural ancestry that places him above ordinary knights. There may even have been a third tradition. Under his Welsh name, Gwalchafed, Galahad may have been treated not merely as the brother of Gwalchmai, the Welsh Gawain, but as another form of the same hero. In that case, Arthur himself could have been regarded as his father and Gwaia as his mother. This would create yet another divine genealogy, one in which the culture hero Arthur takes the place once held by an older Celtic god. The competing family lines of Galahad are therefore not simple mistakes. They reveal how myth changes over time. As stories passed from Welsh tradition into French romance and then into Malory's Great English compilation, names shifted, relationships were rearranged, and separate characters were combined. Yet beneath these changes, the same ancient structure remains visible. A chosen hero is born from a union between a powerful male figure and a woman connected with the supernatural world. Galahad's ancestry is therefore much more than a question of who his father and mother were. It is evidence of the long transformation of Celtic mythology into Arthurian romance. Lancelot, Bors, Ambrosius, Merlin, and even Arthur may all occupy different versions of the same ancient role. Elaine, Ellen, Gwaia, the Empress, and the Lady of the Lake may preserve separate aspects of an older divine woman. Their stories overlap because the medieval romances inherited not one fixed tradition, but many competing memories of the same forgotten myth. The previous discussion focused mainly on Lancelot and, to a lesser extent, on Galahad. The time has now come to examine Galahad more closely, beginning with the origins of his name and the older traditions hidden behind it. In some early versions, Galahad was not only the name of Lancelot's son, it was also used for Lancelot himself. Later romances gradually separated the two figures, reserving the name chiefly for the younger knight who would complete the quest of the Holy Grail. The name Galahad, together with its variants Galad, Galahad, and Galahalt, appears to have developed from the Welsh name Gwalchafed or Gwalchafed. Medieval writers did not use these forms consistently. Malory usually calls Lancelot's son Galahad, though he sometimes uses Galahalt and occasionally adds the title the High Prince. Yet the same or similar names are also given to another warrior, the son of Brunor and Lord of Surluse. This second figure appears elsewhere as Galaho, ruler of the distant isles and a powerful ally of Lancelot. The confusion suggests that the two Galahads may originally have been one character. The title of High Prince probably belonged at first to the famous Grail Knight alone. As different romances developed, however, storytellers divided his qualities between separate heroes. Malory's work even mentions several lesser figures whose names resemble Galahad, creating what almost seems like an entire family connected with Lancelot's bloodline. Among the different forms of the name, Galahad stands closest to the written Welsh Gwalchafed. The shorter form, Galahad, may have emerged through the gradual alteration of pronunciation and spelling as Welsh material passed into French Romance. Names often changed dramatically during this process, especially when scribes no longer understood the language from which they originated. A mysterious spring associated with Galahad offers further support for the Welsh origin of his name. Malory tells how Galahad entered a dangerous forest and discovered a well whose waters boiled violently. When he placed his hand upon it, the heat immediately vanished and the water became calm. The burning spring was said to represent uncontrolled desire, which could not survive the presence of Galahad's perfect purity. The people of the region regarded the event as a miracle and named the spring Galahad's Well. After leaving the well, Galahad entered the country of Gore. This detail is especially interesting because Geoffrey of Monmouth mentions another spring connected with Merlin, calling it the Fountain of Galabais. The names Galabais and Galahad are close enough to suggest that both traditions may refer to the same legendary place. Galabais may represent an intermediate form between the Welsh Gwalchafed and the French Galahad. The Welsh name itself can be divided into two parts. The first element, Gwalch, means a hawk or falcon. The second appears to be connected with Haf, the Welsh word for summer. Gwalchafed may therefore mean hawk of summer. This interpretation places the name beside Gwalchmai, the Welsh form of Gawain, whose name can be understood as Hawk of May. The similarity may not be accidental. Gwalchaved and Gwalchmai seem to belong to the same pattern of solar imagery. May and summer both represent the bright and powerful part of the year, while the hawk rises high into the open sky. The bird may therefore have served as a fitting emblem for a hero connected with sunlight, youth, victory, and the seasonal renewal of the world. Other forms of Gawain's name may preserve similar forgotten titles, possibly meaning white hawk or summer hawk. Although the exact reason for this repeated hawk imagery is difficult to prove, it has parallels elsewhere. The Greek sun god Helios was sometimes imagined in the form of a falcon or associated with birds of prey. The same symbolic idea may have existed among the Celts, where a swift bird moving through the heavens could easily become an image of the sun. Unfortunately, Gwalchaved appears only rarely in surviving Welsh literature. His most important appearance occurs in the tale of Culhwch and Olwen, where he is named among the warriors of Arthur's court. The list includes both Gwalchmai son of Gwaihir and Gwalchaved son of Gwaihir. On the surface, this presents them as brothers born to the same mother. Yet, medieval lists of heroes are not always reliable evidence that every name belonged to a completely separate person. Storytellers often repeated alternative names, titles, and local versions without realizing that they referred to the same original character. It is therefore possible that Gwalchaved was once another name for Gwalchmai. Such an explanation would account for the strange silence surrounding Gwalchaved in other Welsh stories. The opposite possibility must also remain open. Gwalchmai and Gwalchaved may have been separate brothers whose names reflected a shared solar nature. In either case, Gwalchaved was probably imagined as a sun hero. The later Galahad inherited this elevated character, though Christian romance transformed solar brilliance into spiritual purity. Their mother's name, Gwaihir, reveals another ancient layer of mythology. Welsh poets use the word Gwaihir to mean spilled blood. As a personal name, it suggests a woman connected not with gentle motherhood, but with battle, violence, and death. She resembles the Irish Morrigan, a supernatural war goddess who moves across battlefields, foretells destruction, and confronts great heroes. This is very different from the Elaine of the romances, who is usually presented as a beautiful and devoted woman associated with love, motherhood, and the Grail. Behind Elaine and Gwaihir may therefore stand two separate mythological figures whose identities later became confused. Gwaihir belongs to the world of war and divine fury, while Elaine belongs more naturally to the tradition of lake women and enchanted islands. A further sign of Galahad's heroic nature appears in the story of Balin's sword. After Balin's death, the weapon is miraculously preserved for the knight destined to carry it in the future. Only Lancelot and Galahad possess the power to handle it. The sword thus binds father and son together while placing Galahad within an ancient tradition of chosen heroes who alone can claim a supernatural weapon. To understand why Galahad becomes the central figure of the Grail quest, it is necessary to consider the nature of the Grail itself. Medieval romances do not always describe it in the same way. Sometimes it is the sacred vessel used during the Last Supper. In other accounts, it is the container in which Joseph of Arimathea gathered the blood of Christ after the crucifixion. Whatever its exact form, the Grail possesses extraordinary powers. It provides perfect food and drink to those judged worthy of its presence. Its arrival is accompanied by heavenly fragrance, sweetness, and spiritual joy. It can heal every illness and restore strength to the wounded. Yet these gifts are denied to false, sinful, or dishonorable knights. The Grail does not respond merely to courage. It demands moral and spiritual worthiness. According to the legends, the sacred vessel disappeared during the pagan Saxon invasions of Britain. It remained hidden until the age of Arthur, when the Knights of the Round Table were called to search for it. Many began the journey, but only one was destined to complete it fully. That knight was Galahad. The unknown author of the Quest of the Holy Grail made a brilliant choice by placing this spiritual mission in the hands of Arthur's warriors. Long before the Grail became part of their world, Arthur and his followers were already famous in Welsh tradition for pursuing impossible objects, entering supernatural lands, and accepting dangerous tasks that ordinary men would never attempt. The Grail expedition, therefore, did not appear from nowhere. It was placed over an older Celtic structure of heroic adventure. A strong parallel can be found in Arthur's search for the magical cauldron of Diranach. Like the Grail, the cauldron is a supernatural vessel that must be taken from a distant and dangerous realm. Both quests involve a sacred object, a chosen company of heroes, and a journey into territory lying beyond the ordinary world. The tale of Culhwch and Olwen is filled with similar missions. Arthur's court appears there as the great gathering place of champions capable of hunting impossible creatures, obtaining magical weapons, finding hidden prisoners, and crossing the boundary between the human world and the other world. The Christian Grail quest was therefore a natural continuation of the older pagan adventures associated with Arthur. The surviving Grail romances can broadly be divided into two groups. The first group describes the search itself, the arrival of the Grail at Arthur's court, the vows of the knights, their journeys, their failures, and Galahad's final success. The second group attempts to explain the Grail's earlier history and how it came to Britain. The stories about the Grail's origins appear to have been created later. Once the quest became famous, audiences naturally wanted to know where the sacred vessel had come from, who first guarded it, and why it was hidden in Britain. Writers responded by building elaborate prehistories around it. One major tradition made Joseph of Arimathea the central figure. According to this version, Joseph carried the Grail from the Holy Land to Britain. Accompanied by followers and converts, he helped establish Christianity in the island. This story became closely associated with Glastonbury, which claimed an ancient connection with Joseph and the earliest British Church. The Glastonbury tradition also had political value. English rulers could use it to argue that Christianity had reached Britain independently of Rome. Whenever relations with the papacy became strained, the claim that Britain possessed its own ancient apostolic foundation offered a powerful answer to Roman authority. Another version gives Joseph a less direct role. Instead of personally leading the conversion of Britain, he passes the Grail to relatives or successors bearing names that appear strongly Celtic. The most important among them is Bronn, who becomes the guardian of the sacred vessel and the leader of the mission. This second tradition was less popular in continental romance, but it has an important parallel in Wales. Welsh triads sometimes claim that Bran the Blessed was the first person to bring Christianity to Britain. According to this story, Bran had spent several years in Rome as a hostage after the capture of his son Caraticus by the Roman commander Ostorius Scapula. When he returned, he carried the Christian faith with him. Historically, this account cannot be accepted. Roman writers do not say that the father of Caraticus was captured with him, and other evidence identifies the British ruler Cunobelinus as his father. The legend arose not from reliable history, but from the combination of similar names and misunderstood traditions. The Bran of Welsh mythology is called Bendigeid Fran, meaning Bran the Blessed. He is one of the most extraordinary figures in the Mabinogi. He is so enormous that no ordinary house can contain him, and no ship is large enough to carry him. He walks through the sea while others sail beside him. His severed head continues speaking after death and later protects Britain from invasion. Such a being is clearly not an ordinary historical king or an early Christian missionary. Yet later, writers softened his supernatural features. Instead of describing him as a giant god, they presented him simply as the largest, bravest, and most generous man of his age. His ancient title, the Blessed, was then reinterpreted in a Christian sense. The confusion deepened because mythological Bran had a son named Caradog. This Caradog was known as Caradog Strongarm and entered French romance as Carados Brief-Bras. His name resembled that of the historical British leader Caratacus. Later writers therefore assumed that the two were the same man. Once Caradog was identified with Caratacus, Bran naturally became the supposed father of the historical rebel. Writers then asked why Bran carried the title Blessed. The answer was easily invented. He must have earned it by introducing Christianity to Britain. Through this chain of false identifications, a pagan god was transformed into an early Christian missionary. The resulting legend resembles the kind of historical invention often associated with Geoffrey of Monmouth. though it does not actually appear in his surviving work. There is also no firm evidence that the story developed early enough to influence the first romances concerning the origins of the Grail. Even so, the parallel between Bronn and Bran remains significant. Both are connected with a sacred vessel, an ancient lineage, the protection of Britain, and the arrival of a new religious order. The Christian Grail tradition may therefore preserve memories of a far older Celtic myth in which Bran guarded a magical cauldron associated with abundance, restoration, and the otherworld. Galahad's role becomes clearer when viewed against this background. He is not simply a morally perfect medieval knight who succeeds where others fail. He inherits the position once occupied by older solar and divine heroes. His name connects him with the Hawk of Summer, his mother with ancient figures of war and sovereignty, and his quest with the supernatural expeditions of early Welsh tradition. Christian romance reshaped all these elements. The magical cauldron became the Holy Grail. The pagan journey into the otherworld became a spiritual test. The bright sun hero became the virgin knight. The warrior's victory was no longer measured only through strength in battle, but through purity, humility, and closeness to God. Galahad stands at the meeting point of these traditions. Beneath the armor of the Christian Grail, Knight survives the outline of Gwalchafed, the mysterious Hawk of Summer, a hero whose roots reach deep into the forgotten mythology of Celtic Britain. Among all the knights who set out in search of the Holy Grail, Galahad stands above the rest. In the quest of the Holy Grail, he is given the highest position, while Percival, who had occupied the central role in earlier versions of the legend, is gradually pushed into the background. Galahad, or Gwalchafed in the older Welsh tradition, becomes the perfect knight, the one hero capable of completing the sacred mission. If Gwalchafed was originally imagined as either the brighter brother or a more powerful form of Gwalchmai, then his rise to prominence becomes easier to understand. Gwalchmai remains second only to him. After Galahad completes the Grail quest and passes into heaven, the sacred vessel disappears from the world. According to the romance, it is seen only once more, and then by Gwalchmai alone. This final vision confirms his status as the knight closest to Galahad in spiritual worth. The success of both heroes is explained through their purity. The romance repeatedly presents chastity as the highest of knightly virtues, and Galahad becomes its perfect representative. His spiritual strength is shown not through romantic conquest, but through his complete freedom from desire. The entire story is built around the claim that only a knight untouched by moral corruption can come fully into the presence of the Grail. Yet, this raises an important question. Why did medieval storytellers choose chastity as the defining quality of their greatest hero? A knight like Galahad would have seemed strangely out of place in the courts where Arthurian romances were performed. Those courts celebrated admiration, courtly love, flirtation, and romantic devotion. A hero who remained completely detached from such concerns hardly fitted the normal world of chivalric entertainment. The influence of monastic and religious ideals may explain part of the answer. Medieval religious orders placed great value on self-control, celibacy, and the rejection of physical desire. The author of the Grail romance could easily have drawn on these beliefs when constructing Galahad's character. Yet this does not fully explain why similar restraint appears much earlier in Welsh stories, where several heroes behave with unusual caution toward women. Gwalchmai, Peredur, and Owain all belong to a class of characters who appear to preserve features of much older sun heroes. Despite repeatedly finding themselves in intimate or dangerous situations, they are rarely accused of serious sexual misconduct. This consistency is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Peredur, for example, is placed more than once in situations where a less restrained hero might easily take advantage of a woman, yet he behaves with respect and control. Gwalchmai faces an even more famous test in the English romance of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. There, the lady of the castle repeatedly attempts to seduce him, but he carefully protects both his honor and the rules of hospitality. In the quest of the Holy Grail, Galahad surpasses every other knight in purity. Welsh tradition, however, gives very little attention to him. In the surviving Welsh stories, it is Gwalchmai who seems to represent the highest standard. He is given neither a wife nor a permanent lover, and his reputation remains remarkably free from scandal. French, Norman, and English authors did not always preserve this feature. They often treated Gawain, Percival, and similar heroes like ordinary knights of romance, giving them relationships and adventures that placed them closer to the wider courtly tradition. The Welsh storytellers, however, maintained a more restrained image. This cannot be explained by imagining that medieval Welsh society possessed a higher moral standard than neighboring cultures. Welsh legends contain many figures whose conduct is openly violent, treacherous, or sexually destructive. Medrawd, Melwas, Goronwy, and Gylfaethwy are only a few examples. The unusual behavior of heroes like Peredur and Gwalchmai must therefore arise from something more specific than a general desire to present the Welsh as morally superior. The contrast between the Welsh and French versions of Peredur's visit to Blanchefleur makes this especially clear. In the Welsh account, Peredur behaves with an almost modern sense of delicacy. The French version by Chrétien de Troyes is much less restrained. Perceval and Blanchefleur spend the night lying together, though the exact nature of their intimacy remains partly veiled. Some scholars have argued that the French version probably stands closer to ordinary medieval behavior. The scene resembles a custom once found in several European regions in which an unmarried couple might share a bed while expected to observe certain limits. This practice was not unique to Wales. Similar customs existed in Scotland and Scandinavia, and may also have appeared in England. Even so, the restraint of the Welsh version should not be dismissed as deliberate censorship. The storyteller was probably not trying to cleanse an embarrassing scene or impose a later moral code. He may simply have inherited a tradition in which Peredur's unusual behavior already formed an essential part of the hero's character. Welsh storytellers were rarely inventing their material from nothing. They acted more like editors of ancient narratives whose original meaning they only partly understood. Their stories preserved distant echoes of mythology, even when those echoes had become faint or confused. The question, then, is not why the storyteller decided to make Peredur unusually chaste, but what feature of the older myth caused him to appear that way. The answer may lie in the childhood of the solar hero. The legends of Liw in Wales and Cú Chulainn in Ireland repeatedly emphasize supernatural growth. These figures do not pass through childhood in an ordinary way. They develop with impossible speed and display the strength, skill, and intelligence of mature warriors while still extremely young. Cú Chulainn is the clearest example. By the age of 7, he is already a terrifying fighter capable of defeating experienced warriors. The myths treat him as both child and adult at the same time. His body belongs to youth, but his actions belong to a legendary champion. This strange combination may explain the restraint of later Arthurian knights descended from the same mythological type. When ancient myths were transformed into medieval romances, storytellers naturally adjusted the ages of their heroes. A knight fighting in tournaments and traveling through royal courts could no longer be presented as a 7-year-old child. His age was therefore increased or simply left unmentioned. Yet other features of the childhood story remained. The hero continued to show little interest in women because, in the original myth, he had not yet reached full adulthood. What later readers interpreted as moral purity may once have been no more than the natural indifference of a supernatural child. There was no need for medieval authors to invent romantic adventures for every hero. As a result, the old absence of sexual interest remained within the story, even after the hero's age had been normalized. Without intending to create an ascetic knight, storytellers produced characters who seemed more self-controlled than those around them. This theory can also be tested through Cú Chulainn himself. The Irish stories in which he appears belong to a social world far rougher than the polished courts of Arthurian romance. Their values are often harsh, violent, and openly physical. Male chastity is not praised, and female modesty is only occasionally emphasized. Kings sometimes insist on marrying women who have belonged to no other man, but such expectations are inconsistent. Cú Chulainn, therefore, does not live in a society that encourages spiritual purity. He is treated as an adult warrior in almost every part of the narrative, despite being little more than a child. Yet even in these early tales, he occasionally refuses the attention of women who desire him because of his fame. One of the most important examples is the Morrigan. She approaches him directly and offers him her love, but Cuchulainn rejects her. His refusal is not based on Christian morality or courtly loyalty. It belongs to a mythological pattern in which the young hero is not yet prepared to accept the goddess who confronts him. This pattern may survive in the later stories of Gwalchmai, Peredur, and Galahad. Their restraint was eventually reinterpreted as moral excellence. In the Christian Grail romance, what began as the innocence of the young son hero becomes the sacred chastity of the chosen knight. Cuchulainn's legends preserve another unusual custom that helps reveal the ancient social world behind these stories. It concerns gestures of submission and the way defeated people attempted to calm a stronger opponent. Across many cultures, surrender has been expressed through deliberate helplessness. A small animal may roll onto its back before a larger one, exposing itself to show that it no longer intends to resist. Human societies developed similar gestures. A defeated person might kneel, bow, lie flat on the ground, or place himself beneath the foot of a ruler. Such actions communicate a simple message. There is no need for violence because resistance has already ended. In some traditional societies, subjects showed absolute submission by lying before their chief and allowing him to place a foot upon their necks. The pose recreated the position of a conquered enemy beneath a victorious warrior. Less extreme forms of the same gesture survive in bowing, kneeling, curtsying, and removing one's hat. Clothing and weapons could also become symbols of resistance. A defeated warrior who surrendered his sword, belt, gloves, or helmet demonstrated that he no longer posed a threat. Captives were often stripped by victorious armies, both as humiliation and as proof of their helplessness. Ancient Near Eastern rulers frequently displayed prisoners without clothing. Biblical texts preserve the memory of such practices. Captives led away barefoot and exposed became visible symbols of military defeat. Sackcloth, bare feet, and uncovered bodies also expressed grief, fear, repentance, or submission before a greater power. Similar ceremonies continued in medieval Europe. Defeated citizens might approach a victorious ruler barefoot, bareheaded, and dressed only in simple shirts while carrying the keys of their town. By removing the clothing and objects associated with status, they placed themselves entirely at the mercy of the conqueror. Over time, these dramatic acts became less severe. Among men, the removal of a hat developed into an ordinary mark of respect. Court dress and formal gestures may preserve faint traces of older ceremonies in which exposing the body demonstrated obedience and vulnerability. In some societies, however, the original form survived much longer. Visitors approaching a powerful ruler might be required to remove most or all of their clothing. Even members of the ruler's own household could be expected to follow the custom. The body itself became proof that no weapon was hidden and no resistance intended. Ancient Irish tradition knew similar gestures. Women sometimes used the exposure of their bodies as a way to stop an enraged warrior, especially Cuchulainn. This was not primarily an act of seduction. It functioned as an appeal for mercy, a declaration of helplessness powerful enough to interrupt violence. One episode occurs when the warriors of Ulster arrive unexpectedly at the court of Ailill and Queen Medb in Connaught. Their chariots approach at terrifying speed, and Medb fears that bloodshed will erupt as soon as they enter the court. She understands that the visitors must be welcomed immediately and with complete generosity. Medb therefore goes out to meet them with her daughter and a great company of young women. The Ulster warriors accept the gesture, and each chooses a companion from among those sent to receive them. Cuchulainn selects the queen's daughter. The scene belongs to a world very different from that of Galahad. It is filled with political hospitality, physical danger, and customs that later romance would struggle to understand. Yet it helps explain how the same hero could appear both innocent and fully adult. Cuchulainn remains a supernatural child even while acting as a warrior, guest, and champion. When the old mythology passed into Arthurian literature, the harsher customs faded. The hero's childhood disappeared, his age increased, and his world became more refined. But his distance from ordinary romantic desire remained. From that survival came the remarkable purity of the Solar Knights. Peredur's delicacy, Gwalchmai's self-control, and Galahad's complete chastity may all descend from the same ancient source. What began as the untouched state of a rapidly growing divine child was transformed first into knightly restraint and finally into the supreme Christian virtue required to behold the Holy Grail. This earlier example helps explain the meaning of the custom, even though the clothing of the women is not described in that particular scene. Whenever Cu Chulainn himself stands at the center of the story, however, the texts are far more explicit. If he returned from battle still consumed by rage and apparently unsatisfied by the fighting he had already done, women were sent out to confront him in a deliberately disordered and exposed state. The practice was not necessarily limited to the Gaelic-speaking Celts of Ireland. A Roman source suggests that a related custom also existed among the Britons. Pliny the Elder records that during certain religious ceremonies, the wives and daughters-in-law of British families appeared without ordinary clothing and covered their bodies with black pigment, giving them, in his description, the appearance of Ethiopians. The religious setting does not fundamentally change the meaning of the act. Gestures of submission often move from the political world into the sacred one. The posture first used by a defeated warrior before a conqueror may later be adopted by a slave before a master, a subject before a king, and finally, a worshipper before a god. Prayer itself can be understood as a request addressed to a divine power in much the same way that one person appeals to another. Sacrifice follows a similar pattern, presenting the deity with a gift as though divine favor could be gained through the same forms of persuasion used in human society. The god honored in the British ceremony, described by Pliny, may have been a dark divinity, perhaps the Celtic ruler of the dead, or another figure connected with the otherworld. If so, the black coloring worn by the women may have served as a symbolic form of identification. By taking on the appearance associated with the god, the worshippers could have been attempting to gain his sympathy or approval. Whether or not that interpretation is correct, the custom fits closely with the Irish stories of Cu Chulainn. One of the most dramatic episodes occurs after his first raid into enemy territory. Though still a child, he returns toward Emain Macha in the king's chariot, blazing with supernatural fury. A watchman sees him approaching from a distance and immediately understands the danger. From the violent speed of the chariot and the hero's terrifying appearance, he predicts that Cu Chulainn will spill blood inside the royal settlement unless something is done before he arrives. The king acts at once. Under the leadership of the queen, the women of the court go out to meet the young warrior. They appear before him with their hair loosened and expose their bodies as part of the ritual confrontation. The queen then challenges him with the declaration that powerful opponents are waiting to face him. Cu Chulainn reacts exactly as expected. Rather than looking at them, he covers his face. At that moment, the warriors of Ulster seize him and place him into a vessel of cold water. His supernatural heat is so intense that the first container bursts. A second begins to boil, and only after further cooling does his battle rage finally disappear. The remarkable feature of the story is Cu Chulainn's age. He is said to be only about 7 years old. He has already entered enemy territory, killed opponents, and returned in a state of fury so dangerous that an entire royal court fears his arrival. Yet, in the presence of the women, he behaves with the embarrassment and modesty of a child. This reaction becomes one of his best-known characteristics. Later, enemies even attempt to use it against him. In one story, a man and a woman approach him with a plan to kill him. While the man prepares the attack, the woman begins removing her clothing. Cu Chulainn immediately turns away and covers his face. His charioteer warns him that the situation is a trap, but he refuses to look. His sense of shame is so strong that he remains exposed to danger rather than face the woman directly. The charioteer finally intervenes, striking the woman down with a stone. Only then does Cu Chulainn uncover his eyes and confront the armed attacker. The duel ends with the death of his remaining enemy. The episode reveals that his reaction is not ordinary romantic restraint. It is almost a magical weakness, deeply embedded in his identity. He can endure violence, wounds, and supernatural terror, but the sight of an exposed woman causes him to withdraw completely. To compare this Irish hero with Galahad, several stages of transformation must be imagined. An Irish myth cannot be placed directly beside a medieval Christian romance without accounting for the centuries of change between them. The ancient Irish story would first need to be compared with a related Welsh myth. That Welsh myth would then have passed into oral heroic narrative. Later storytellers would reshape it into a courtly tale, and finally, a French or English romancer would place it within the elaborate world of Arthurian chivalry. Because so many stages lie between the two traditions, the surviving evidence is naturally incomplete. Names shift, motives are altered, and religious interpretations replace older meanings. Yet, the underlying pattern remains recognizable. Cuchulainn and Galahad appear to belong to the same broad family of supernatural heroes. Both possess extraordinary abilities from an early age, both stand apart from ordinary warriors. Most importantly, both are distinguished by an unusual relationship with sexuality and the presence of women. In Cuchulainn's case, the quality appears as youthful embarrassment or an instinctive refusal to look. In Galahad's story, it becomes absolute chastity. The older heroic peculiarity has been transformed into a Christian virtue. This does not mean that Galahad is simply Cuchulainn under another name. The traditions are too distant and too complex for such a direct identification. Yet their shared features suggest descent from a common mythological type, the young divine champion whose exceptional power is matched by his separation from normal adult desire. Even if the precise origin of these characteristics remains uncertain, the comparison still carries us beyond the simple explanation that Galahad's chastity was invented entirely by medieval monks or romance writers. The idea seems to reach much further back. The moral atmosphere of an Irish heroic tale differs enormously from that of the Christian Grail romances. The Irish stories belong to a world of feasting, raids, violent competition, supernatural frenzy, and uncertain social boundaries. The Grail cycle belongs to a world of confession, spiritual testing, sin, divine judgment, and sacramental symbolism. Despite this distance, the two traditions can still move along similar lines because both preserve elements inherited from a much older mythological source. The outward meaning changes, but the structure beneath it survives. The Grail romances also contain features that are entirely Christian and have little connection with Celtic mythology. At times, their religious symbolism becomes extremely literal. Sacred objects are treated almost as magical instruments, and long passages of theological explanation can overwhelm the adventure itself. Such material can make the stories feel repetitive and excessively didactic. Yet the romances also possess genuine power, especially when they draw upon the older heroic traditions inherited from Britain. Their choice of Galahad as the supreme knight is one of the clearest examples. The Christian author did not create his hero from nothing. He worked with a figure shaped by older Celtic tradition, whether Galahad is understood as Gwalchmai, Gwalchmai's brother, or another version of Gwalchmai himself. The nature of Galahad's superiority also reflects this inheritance. He is not simply stronger than the other knights. His greatness lies in a quality that separates him from ordinary human weakness. The romance transforms that difference into complete purity and makes it the key to the Grail. Gwalchmai receives almost equally favorable treatment. Across Welsh tradition, he appears as one of Arthur's most honorable companions. He is brave without being cruel, tested without becoming corrupted, and repeatedly acts as a mediator when conflict threatens to destroy the court. Few figures in Celtic legend possess a reputation as consistently admirable as his. He is remembered not only for his strength, but also for his courtesy, self-control, loyalty, and willingness to make peace. These qualities made him a natural model for the later image of the spiritually disciplined knight. The French and Norman romances expanded the emotional and romantic world surrounding Arthur's heroes. Under the influence of aristocratic courts, they refined the language of courtly love and transformed passion into one of the central forces of chivalric literature. Chrétien de Troyes played a major role in giving this tradition its most elegant form. His romances helped establish the dangerous beauty of courtly love, where loyalty, secrecy, suffering, and desire could raise a knight to greatness, while also leading him toward ruin. The author of The Quest of the Holy Grail followed a different path. Instead of presenting romantic passion as the highest inspiration of knighthood, he imagined a hero who rises above it completely. Galahad's victory does not come from winning the love of a noblewoman. It comes from resisting every form of corruption that destroys the other knights. His purity allows him to see what they cannot see and to enter places from which they are excluded. The result is a far more demanding ideal. The courtly lover may become noble through devotion, but Galahad becomes almost more than human through renunciation. He does not master desire by directing it toward one worthy woman. He leaves desire behind altogether. Yet the foundation of this ideal remains Celtic. Beneath the Christian symbolism stands the older image of the youthful solar hero. Brilliant, extraordinary, difficult to approach, and strangely untouched by ordinary adult life. For this reason, neither Galahad nor Gwalchmai can be regarded as purely French or Norman creations. Their surviving literary forms were certainly shaped by continental writers, but the essential characters reach back into the Brythonic world. French poets polished them, Christian authors reinterpreted them, and English writers preserved them in new forms. But the heroes themselves emerged from the legendary traditions of Celtic Britain. The final Galahad is therefore the product of many ages. In him, the supernatural youth of ancient mythology becomes the disciplined knight of Arthur's court, and finally, the flawless Christian champion of the Grail. His chastity may appear at first to belong entirely to medieval religion. Looked at more closely, however, it may preserve the distant memory of a much older hero who stood apart from women not because he had taken a sacred vow, but because he was still, beneath all his armor and glory, the divine child of the ancient tales.